At 2:23 p.m. on the 4th of July, a phone camera caught 18-year-old Nolan Wells on the back of a boat, laughing, shirtless, reaching for something below deck. It's the last confirmed image of him alive. Before the sheriff called it an accident within the hour. Before an independent pathologist stood in front of a room of reporters and turned a private tragedy into a national argument. Just a boy on a boat, mid-laugh, with less than a day left. No idea what was coming. What happened between that timestamp and the moment his body was pulled from the water off Horn Island still doesn't have an answer. Not because nobody's looked, because some of the people who were supposed to look never got the chance to look at everything. If a case like this is the reason you're here, subscribe now, because we're going to walk through every piece of this the way the people investigating it should have from day one, carefully, and without skipping the parts that are inconvenient. Nolan Xavier Wells was 18. On July 4th, 2026, he was one of a small number, worth naming plainly because the racial makeup of that crowd is part of why this case drew attention in the first place, not because his race made his death matter more, but because it made the silence afterward feel, to so many watching, painfully familiar, of black teenagers and a crowd investigators now estimate at 300 to 400 people, gathered on and around Horn Island off the Mississippi coast. By that evening, he was gone. His body was recovered days later. And the first official word out of Mississippi authorities came almost immediately, and it came fast. Accidental. No foul play. A young man who, they said, had chosen to stay behind on the island without his phone. That explanation arrived before any autopsy had been performed. Before anyone had asked the boat's other passengers a single hard question. It's the kind of timeline that once you notice it, you can't stop noticing. And the internet noticed it first. Within days of that statement, thousands of people who had never heard of Horn Island were watching the same video clip on a loop, asking the same question in the comments underneath it. If he chose to stay behind, why didn't he keep his phone? Why would an 18-year-old, with no plan to be alone, hand over the one thing that could call for help? Nobody in those comment sections claims to know exactly what happened to Nolan Wells that night. What they kept saying, over and over, in threads that stacked up hundreds of replies apiece, was simpler than that. They didn't believe what they'd been told so far. That distrust didn't come from nowhere, though not every detail driving it holds up under a second look. One claim that spread fast said Nolan was found fully clothed, which felt impossible to square with a boy who'd had no shirt on hours earlier. But the volunteer search crew, who actually spotted his body from the air, have since been direct about what they saw. Swim trunks, no shirt, no shoes. Face down at the shoreline. The same as the last video anyone has of him alive. It's worth pausing on that correction, because it says something about how a story like this spreads. A detail gets repeated once, gets read a certain way by everyone who wasn't there, and by the time it reaches a comment section, it's hardened into fact. The people who were actually on that search never had a shirt to explain. What they had, and still have, are the questions nobody's answered. This is the part of the story where most coverage moves on. This one doesn't, because what a second independent autopsy found is where the real questions start. The people who covered it first moved on within days, back to whatever story replaced this one in the rotation. What kept this one alive past that point wasn't a network's editorial calendar. It was a family that refused to let the story end on someone else's schedule. On July 19th, more than 2 weeks after Nolan Wells died, a board-certified forensic pathologist named Dr. Roger Mitchell stood at a podium at the NAACP's National Convention and read a report he had spent days preparing. He was not the first person to examine Nolan's body. Mississippi's own medical examiners had already done that weeks earlier, and it was their initial call. Accidental, no foul play, that had shaped the story ever since. Dr. Mitchell's job was to look again. And by his own account, what he was allowed to look at was incomplete. The body he received had already been autopsied once. Organs had already been removed, examined, and returned, which, he was careful to explain, is completely standard. What wasn't standard, or at least wasn't something he could account for, was what came back missing. The trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the hyoid bone. The entire interior structure of the throat simply wasn't there. He didn't call it evidence of a cover-up. He was precise about that, the same way he was precise about everything else in that report. He said it's common practice for an examiner to hold those structures back for further study. He said if he'd had concerns about the neck, he might have done the same thing himself, back when he ran the D.C. medical examiner's office. What he did say, plainly, is that a neck dissection performed without those structures is incomplete, and that he could not, therefore, rule out injury to the neck as a cause of death. That single detail is the one the internet has not let go of. Of everything in a report that ran for pages, it's the throat that keeps resurfacing, in comment threads with 700 likes, in replies 44 deep, in questions typed out at 2 a.m. by people who never met Nolan Wells and can't explain why they can't stop thinking about him. Not because it proves anything on its own. Because it's the one gap in the story that a second look should have been able to close, and didn't. There was a second finding, and it's the one that made a room full of reporters go quiet. Dissecting the back of the head, Dr. Mitchell found an area of red discoloration in the soft tissue overlying the skull, roughly the size of a credit card, laid flat. No skull fracture. No cut in the skin above it. He was careful, again, not to name it. He said the cause of that discoloration is unclear. It could be an injury. It could be nothing more than blood settling after death, the same way it does in almost every body left lying in one position for long enough. Without being able to examine the brain itself for signs of bleeding, information the first autopsy would have captured, and this one couldn't recover, there was no way for him to say which explanation was true. That's the part worth sitting with for a second, because it's easy to rush past. After death, the body doesn't bruise the way it does in life. Blood doesn't pressurize and pool at the site of an impact anymore. It just settles, pulled down by gravity, wherever the body happens to be resting. A mark that looks alarming can turn out to be nothing more than that. Or it can be exactly what it looks like, decomposition, and the days that had already passed by the time anyone got a second look made it almost impossible to tell the difference. And there's a reason the timing of all of this matters as much as the findings themselves. Toxicology, the test that would say whether drugs or alcohol played any role in what happened that night, hadn't come back yet, even by the time Dr. Mitchell gave his report. He didn't put a number of weeks on it. He didn't need to. Every pathologist who's ever answered a question like this one says roughly the same thing. It can take weeks. Sometimes it takes months. What that means, in practice, is that the most complete version of this story, the one that could actually answer the question everyone keeps asking, was still sitting in a lab somewhere, unfinished, while a family buried their son without it. 2 findings then, sitting side by side at the start of the story. A gap in the exam nobody's explained. A mark on the skull nobody's explained either. Neither one is proof of anything on its own. Together, they're the reason this case never got to close quietly the way the first 60 minutes assumed it would. There's more to this than one report. The other families who've stood exactly where Nolan's parents are standing now are where this goes next. That question is where the story picks back up. Here's the part of the story that the family's attorney didn't have to go looking for. It came to him. Because once Nolan Wells' name started spreading, 2 other families reached out with stories that landed like echoes. Different states. Different water. In one case, no water at all. But the shape of what happened to their sons was close enough to Nolan's that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like something else. The first was Daniel Irvin, 18 years old. He went out on a fishing boat with 2 other young men, and by every account given afterward, he was the only black person on that trip. What's said to have happened next is that he drowned accidentally, according to the 2 friends who came back without him. What's not in dispute is what those 2 friends did in the hours after. They took his cell phone and got rid of it. They took his clothes and got rid of those too. And then, according to the family, they went back through their own phones and deleted every text message and social media exchange they'd ever had with him. Read that sentence again slowly because it's worth it. Not, we don't know what happened to his phone. Not, it must have fallen in the water. Someone made a decision, more than once, to remove evidence before anyone official ever asked for it. The 2 friends were charged. Not with anything related to Daniel's death. Tampering with evidence. That's the full extent of it, as of this telling. His mother has said publicly that she believes the charge should be murder, because in her words, if they were willing to lie about a phone, about clothes, about months of messages, There's no reason to believe they'd tell the truth about anything else. The second case is Tyler Smith, also 18, also the only black person in the group he was with, this time at a house party on the 4th of July, roughly 10 other people in attendance. Tyler ended up shot in the head. The story his friends gave police was that it happened during a game of Russian roulette. Some of them got rid of the gun before anyone official arrived. And when it was all said and done, police accepted that explanation without, according to Tyler's mother and grandmother, doing something as basic as a gunshot residue test on his hands, or on anyone else's. The reasoning they were given when they pushed is almost hard to repeat out loud. If it really was Russian roulette, the reasoning went, everyone in the room would have residue on their hands anyway, so there was no point testing for it. Sit with that logic for a second because it only works if you've already decided not to look too closely. None of this proves what happened to Nolan Wells. That has to be said plainly because it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Daniel Irvin's case is Daniel Irvin's case. Tyler Smith's is his own. Nolan's is still, by the medical examiner's own account, undetermined. But when the family's attorney stood up and put these three names next to each other, a boy who drowned and left his phone behind, a boy whose friends threw away his phone and his clothes and deleted their messages, a boy who was shot and whose friends got rid of the gun before police walked in, he wasn't asking anyone to believe a conspiracy. He was asking a simpler question. If the roles in any of these three stories were reversed, if it had been a group of black teenagers who came back without a white friend, who disposed of his phone, who deleted their messages, who got rid of a weapon before police arrived, is there anyone watching who genuinely believes those investigations would have moved this slowly or closed this fast? That question is the same one that's been running underneath every comment section, every late-night thread, every stranger typing out a theory about a boy they never met. It isn't really about proving one specific version of what happened on that island. It's about noticing that the instinct to believe the easiest explanation only seems to show up when the victim looks a certain way. Because just like the NAACP once stood up when Mississippi took the life of a teenager named Emmett Till, just like it stood up when the state took the life of Medgar Evers, the people in that room weren't drawing a straight line between decades. They were pointing at a pattern that keeps finding new names to attach itself to. It's worth asking what a pattern like this actually costs, beyond the individual families living inside each case. Every time a death like this one gets waved off in its first hour and only reopened under public pressure weeks later, it teaches a quiet lesson to everyone watching closely enough to learn it. It teaches investigators that speed matters more than accuracy when the story is still small. It teaches communities that attention, not evidence, is what actually moves an investigation forward. And it teaches families, long before anything happens to them personally, that they should expect to fight for the same basic fairness other families receive by default. That's a corrosive lesson to keep reteaching case after case, because it doesn't just affect the people directly involved. It shapes how an entire community understands its relationship to the institutions that are supposed to protect it. Trust, once spent this way, doesn't rebuild itself quietly. It has to be earned back one thoroughly handled case at a time, and every case handled the way this one was initially handled sets that rebuilding further back. There's also a cost that falls specifically on the people who did nothing wrong but happened to be present. Every uncharged individual connected to a case like this one lives, for however long it stays unresolved, inside a kind of public suspicion they can't fully answer because the official record hasn't given anyone a clean way to rule anything in or out. That's part of why the standard matters so much here. A thorough, fast, transparent investigation doesn't just serve the family asking for answers. It protects everyone else attached to the story, guilty or innocent, from spending months inside a cloud of half-formed public judgment that a completed investigation could have dispersed in days. Back to the report itself, because the questions raised by Irvin and Smith don't mean anything without grounding them in what's actually known about Nolan. When the medical experts sat down afterward to break down what they'd just heard, the first thing worth noting is what they didn't do. They didn't pile on. A board-certified physician watching alongside the anchor made a point of saying, clearly, that Dr. Mitchell had done careful, honest work, that he stuck to facts, offered possibilities without asserting conclusions, and was transparent about every limitation he ran into. That matters, because it's easy for a story like this to tip into pure speculation. What actually happened in that press conference was closer to the opposite. A pathologist repeatedly saying, in effect, "Here's what I can tell you, here's what I can't, and here's exactly why." The detail that made the physician nearly come out of her chair, in her words, was the same one the internet had already locked onto: the missing hyoid bone. It's a small, U-shaped piece of bone that sits in the neck, and it doesn't connect to any other bone in the body. If someone is choked, strangled, or has pressure applied to the throat with real force, the hyoid is one of the places medical examiners are trained to look first, because it fractures in a distinctive way that's difficult to explain as anything other than direct compression. That's not the only thing it can reveal. A hyoid bone found completely intact tells its own story, too, one that leans away from strangulation as an explanation, though it still doesn't rule out other forms of pressure applied lower in the neck or higher near the jaw. Either finding, present or absent, damaged or intact, narrows the range of what could have happened in a way almost nothing else in a standard autopsy can match. That's precisely why its absence here carries more weight than a single missing bone normally would. It isn't just one data point among many. For the specific question everyone keeps circling back to, whether force was involved in what happened to Nolan Wells, it may be the single most important data point available, and it's the one piece nobody outside a small circle of investigators has been allowed to examine. Compare that to almost any other missing detail in this case, and the hierarchy becomes clear. A missing GPS log is inconvenient. A missing text message is frustrating. A missing hyoid bone, in a case already built around the question of how someone ended up in open water, is something closer to losing the one witness who could have settled the argument outright. That's not hyperbole. It's simply what the anatomy represents, and it's why an otherwise technical, easy-to-skim detail in a written report became the single moment that made an entire room of experienced reporters go quiet. Pressure applied to the throat with real force. That bone is one of the places where the damage tends to show up. If it's found intact, that's meaningful information too. Either way, it's one of the clearest physical indicators available for exactly the kind of injury everyone keeps asking about. And it wasn't there to examine. The legal expert on the panel added a piece of nuance worth holding on to because it cuts against the loudest version of the theory circulating online. The missing neck structures, she explained, aren't necessarily gone. In her experience, it's standard for an examiner to hold certain body parts back for further study before releasing the rest of the remains to a family for burial. That doesn't mean nothing suspicious happened. It means the state very likely still has those parts, and the real question isn't where they went. It's why Mississippi's own examiners haven't released their findings on them yet, given how much national attention this case has already drawn. That distinction, missing evidence versus evidence being withheld pending review, is the difference between a cover-up and a slow bureaucracy. Both are frustrating for a grieving family. They are not the same thing. And responsible coverage of this case means being honest about which one you're actually looking at, even when it's less satisfying than the alternative. Callers into the broadcast pushed on that same question relentlessly. One asked, almost too emotional to finish the sentence, whether officials might simply be waiting for public attention to fade before releasing anything uncomfortable. Neither expert on the panel would call it a cover-up outright, not because they were being cautious for its own sake, but because they genuinely didn't have enough information to say so. What they did say is that the amount of time this has taken so far isn't unusual for a water-related death investigated this thoroughly, and that findings involving a body recovered from water routinely get withheld until they're conclusive, precisely because water complicates every single finding a medical examiner makes. Another caller asked something the family themselves have asked publicly. Why can't preliminary physical findings, the parts that don't require waiting on a toxicology report, be shared sooner? It's a fair question, and neither expert had a fully satisfying answer. What they agreed on is this: nobody watching this case from the outside actually knows what has or hasn't already been shared privately with Nolan's family. The silence the public sees isn't necessarily the silence the family is living with. What all of this adds up to 3 weeks in is not an answer. It's a shape. A missing piece of anatomy nobody's explained. A mark on the back of a skull with no confirmed cause. A timeline with a shirt that appears from nowhere. 2 other families who watched almost the same story happen to their own sons in different states, under different circumstances, and came away with the same unfinished feeling. Undetermined isn't the end of a story. In this one, it's where the real questions start. Everything that follows in this script, the competing forensic reads, the boat's own timeline, the family's own words, the strangers still typing questions into comment sections at 2 a.m, is an attempt to push past that word, piece by piece, using only what's actually verifiable along the way. But then, a different broadcast picked up the exact same findings, put them in front of a different medical examiner, and got back a noticeably more cautious read. Not a contradiction of what Dr. Mitchell said. Nobody disputed his findings themselves. A different lens on what those findings actually prove, which, it turns out, is not the same thing. His name is Dr. Kendall Crowns, Chief Medical Examiner for a major metropolitan county, someone who has personally handled autopsies by the thousands. Asked directly about that discolored area on the back of the skull, he didn't reach for the word hemorrhage. Neither, it turns out, had Dr. Mitchell in his own report, a detail that matters more than it sounds like it should. Hemorrhage implies active bleeding, a body still alive enough to bruise. A reddened area is something looser, something that could mean several different things at once. What Dr. Crowns walked through, step by step, is that after death, blood doesn't stop moving entirely. It settles. If a body is placed on its back, which is exactly what happens during transport to another city for a second autopsy, the places where it made contact with that surface are the places where blood gravity pulls toward. On top of that, decomposition itself breaks down muscle tissue in ways that can produce a reddish discoloration that has nothing to do with trauma at all. So when he was asked point blank whether that mark could be blunt force injury, his answer was a no. It could be that. It could also be decomposition. It could also be an artifact of how the body was handled in transit. Without more to go on, there's no way to know which. There's one detail in his explanation worth sitting with because it cuts in a direction the loudest theories online tend to skip past. If there had been real trauma to the back of the head, a blow, an impact, you would generally expect to see something on the surface of the skin too. A bruise, an abrasion, some break in the skin that decomposition wouldn't erase, because those kinds of surface injuries tend to remain visible even in a badly decomposed body. Dr. Mitchell's report didn't describe any of that, just the deep discoloration alone, with nothing on the skin above it to match. That doesn't clear anything. It complicates it, which, if you've been paying attention to how this case keeps unfolding, might be the most honest word for where it actually stands. The missing throat structures got the same treatment from a second set of expert eyes, and landed in almost the same place the legal analyst reached in the report itself. It's standard, Dr. Crowns explained, for a medical examiner to hold on to exactly those structures, the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage, the laryngeal structures, because those are the pieces most closely tied to strangulation. They get dissected, evaluated for fractures, and often handed off to a forensic anthropologist trained to spot microfractures too small to see with the naked eye. It's slow. It's meticulous. And it's very likely exactly what's happening to Nolan's throat right now, sitting with someone whose entire job is to look closer than anyone else could. That explanation should be reassuring. It isn't quite, and it's worth being honest about why. Standard procedure or not, nobody investigating this case has said out loud that those structures are being examined. No mention of it in the report. No timeline for when results might come back. The process being ordinary doesn't make the silence around it feel any less strange to a family who's already waited weeks for answers most people expect within days. Not every voice weighing in on this case has landed on suspicion, and it would be dishonest to only show you the ones that did. A trial attorney watching the same broadcast pushed back hard against the idea that any of this adds up to something sinister. His argument was blunt. A room full of people were reading forensic terminology out loud, mispronouncing half of it, presenting fragments without real conclusions, and calling it transparency. In his view, that's not how you build public trust. That's how you build a conspiracy theory out of raw material that, examined properly, might not support one at all. He raised something else worth including here because it's the kind of caution this story needs more of, not less. A body can carry injuries that have nothing to do with how a person died. Nolan played football. Football players get hurt, in games, in practice, roughhousing with friends. An old injury, A bruise from weeks earlier, a healing scrape. None of it necessarily connects to the night he died, and a preliminary report built on limited access to the body has no way of dating an injury precisely enough to rule that in or out. Suspicion has to be earned by evidence, he argued, not manufactured by unfamiliar words read aloud to a room that's already primed to expect the worst. Both things can be true at once, and that's the uncomfortable place this case actually sits. The findings are strange enough to deserve real scrutiny. They are also incomplete enough that scrutiny can tip into speculation if nobody's careful. A pathologist explaining what he could and couldn't determine is not the same thing as a verdict. Neither is a room full of strangers online, however many of them agree with each other, however many likes stack up under the same theory. What ties both experts together, oddly, is a version of the same idea. You don't read a body in isolation. You read it against everything else, the circumstances, the timeline, the accounts of everyone who was there. One examiner compared it to an arson case, where the fire itself tells you a fire happened, but it's the evidence around the fire. A man who moved his family photos out the day before, who called his insurance company asking about a policy the day before his house burned down. That tells you whether it was an accident or something else entirely. Nolan's body, on its own, has already told the people examining it what it can. Undetermined. What's left is everything around it. And that's exactly where the story goes next, into a timeline of phone signals, deleted messages, and a boat that supposedly took on water and then, somehow, kept moving for hours. It's worth pausing on why two credentialed experts, looking at identical findings, can land in genuinely different places without either of them being wrong. Forensic pathology isn't a science that produces a single inevitable answer from a fixed set of inputs, the way arithmetic does. It's closer to a discipline of probability and pattern recognition, built on years of seeing thousands of bodies in thousands of conditions, and different pathologists develop different instincts for how much weight to put on an ambiguous finding versus how much to withhold judgment until more data exists. That's not a flaw in the field. It's the honest byproduct of working with evidence that decomposition, water, and time have already begun to erase before anyone gets a chance to examine it. The disagreement itself is information. It tells you, more clearly than either expert's individual opinion could, exactly how much this case still depends on data nobody outside the original investigation currently has access to. A phone left behind is one kind of question. A phone that comes back different is another kind entirely. When Nolan's mother finally got her son's phone into her hands, something about it struck her as wrong. Not damage. Not a password she couldn't unlock. It was the absence of something that should have been there, a full day's worth of Snapchat activity, on a device that, by every account, he used constantly. No posts. No stories. Nothing from a day he'd already been photographed and filmed enjoying. But then came an explanation that complicates the suspicion rather than confirms it. According to someone who's actually spent time on Horn Island as part of search operations there, cell signal on that stretch of coastline is notoriously weak. Snapchat, like most apps built around real-time sharing, won't upload anything without a connection. A day with no Snapchat activity isn't necessarily a day where something got erased. It might just be a day where the signal never let anything go out in the first place. That explanation is reasonable. It's also not the same as proof. The difference between the data was never sent and the data was sent and later removed is not something you can settle by looking at a phone screen. It's something you can only settle with a forensic acquisition, a full extraction of everything a device has ever done, including the traces that ordinary deletion leaves behind even when the content itself is gone. That's not speculation. That's how digital forensics actually works, according to an expert in exactly that field who's worked cases at the same level of scrutiny this one deserves. Delete a photo on an iPhone, and it doesn't disappear. It sits in a recoverable state for roughly 30 days before it's truly gone. Empty that trash deliberately, and the content itself may become unrecoverable, but the act of deleting it doesn't vanish. It leaves a log, a timestamp, a record of exactly when someone touched that data and what they did to it. Android phones work a little differently, and the recovery window can be as short as a single day, which means if there's anything to find on a device like that, time matters more than almost anything else in this investigation. None of that tells us, on its own, whether anything was actually deleted from Nolan's phone. What it tells us is that the question is answerable. Somebody, with the right access and the right timing, could know for certain whether that missing day of activity was a signal problem or something else. Whether that's already happened and what it found hasn't been made public. But then there's the boat. And the boat's timeline doesn't require a forensics expert to explain why it doesn't sit right. According to tracking data and a call placed to the Coast Guard, the boat left its original dock at 9:56 in the morning and reached Horn Island by 11:14. Hours later, at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, someone on board called for help, reporting the boat was taking on water. When asked directly whether everyone on board was accounted for and in good health, the answer given was yes, everybody on board was fine. It's a small phrase that carries a lot of weight because it never specifies who everybody refers to or whether Nolan was still considered part of that group at that point. At 4:31, the boat left Horn Island under tow, pulled for roughly 3 miles before the tow was called off. From there, it returned to the original dock, arriving at 5:44, over an hour after the tow ended. Then, instead of staying put, the boat went out again, traveling to a second location before returning to the original dock once more, and only after that round trip did it finally get pulled from the water and loaded onto a trailer. A boat that was sinking badly enough to call for a tow doesn't usually spend the next several hours making additional trips. That gap and that back and forth is the kind of detail that's easy to explain innocently. Mechanical issues get fixed, people get shuttled between locations, plans change. It's also the kind of detail that stays unexplained until someone with authority actually explains it, and so far nobody officially has. There's one more thread worth pulling on here. The towing company that answered that afternoon call gave its own account afterward, that its involvement ended because the boat's owner said help was no longer needed, that other assistance had already been arranged. If that's accurate, it raises its own question. If the emergency had already resolved itself by the time a towboat showed up, what was it that resolved it? A trial attorney watching all of this unfold made the same point he'd made about the autopsy findings, and it's worth repeating here because it cuts both ways. Wanting to know why a boat took on water and whether it was properly repaired before it went back out is a completely legitimate question. So, is wanting to know why it sat docked for over an hour before anyone addressed it. Legitimate questions are not the same thing as answers, and he was careful to say he wasn't accusing anyone on that boat of anything because, in his words, he simply doesn't know. That's the honest place this part of the story sits too. A phone with a missing day. A boat with a timeline that doesn't add up cleanly. Two threads that, on their own, could each have an innocent explanation. Together, they're the reason nobody, not the family, not the people covering this case, not the hundreds of thousands of strangers still typing questions into a comment section at 1 in the morning, has been willing to let this go. What makes both threads frustrating in the same specific way is that neither one requires speculation to resolve. That's worth emphasizing because so much of this case lives in the space between what's known and what's guessed at. The phone's activity log either shows a gap caused by no signal or it doesn't. The boat's full GPS trail either accounts for every minute between the tow call and the trailer, or it doesn't. These are questions that need a jury, a theory, or a comment section to answer. They need someone with the legal authority to pull two specific sets of records and make them public. That's such a simple, mechanical step hasn't happened yet. Weeks into a case that's drawn this much national attention, says less about the mystery of what happened to Nolan Wells and more about how little urgency has been applied to answering questions that were never actually that hard to answer in the first place. That's the note this act ends on, and it's worth carrying forward. This case's hardest open questions were never really about access to exotic evidence. They were about ordinary records, sitting in ordinary systems, waiting on ordinary paperwork that nobody with the authority to sign it has. There's a version of accountability that doesn't require a single new fact to exist. It just requires someone with the authority to act on the facts that already do. That's worth separating out clearly, because it's easy to let a case like this one blur into one giant unanswerable mystery when most of it isn't a mystery at all. A boat's location at a given time isn't a mystery. A phone's activity log isn't a mystery. A set of anatomical structures sitting in a box somewhere isn't a mystery. Each of those is a known, locatable, retrievable piece of information, sitting exactly where it's always been, waiting on a decision rather than a discovery. Calling this case unsolved gives it more mystique than it's earned. What it actually is unresolved by choice, one form and one signature away from being otherwise. That distinction should change how everyone watching this story thinks about what they're actually waiting for. Not a break in the case. A break in the silence. Prioritized yet. The forensic and digital threads only tell half of the story. The other half belongs to the two people who have had to live inside it since July 4th. Before any of this had a hashtag, before a single expert sat down in front of a camera to explain lividity or decomposition or the significance of a bone smaller than your thumb, two people had to walk into a room full of strangers and introduce themselves as Nolan Wells' parents. Christine went first. She thanked the people who'd shown up before she said anything about her son, because that's the kind of person grief had made her into, someone who leads with gratitude even while she's breaking. She said losing a child is a pain you can't measure, and that Nolan wasn't just her son. He was someone who brought light into rooms other people had already given up on. She didn't dress it up. She said there aren't too many genuine people like him in the world, and losing that kind of person at 18, under circumstances nobody's explained, has been the hardest thing she's ever lived through. What she asked for wasn't complicated. Not an arrest. Not a verdict. Just an answer to one question: what happened to her son? She said it plainly, more than once, like she needed the room to understand it wasn't rhetorical. That's the only question that matters to her. Everything else, the theories, the comment sections, the cable news panels picking apart a report line by line, is happening around a mother who just wants to know what happened to her child. And in the middle of that, she's had to absorb something almost nobody talks about when they cover a case like this: the public turning on her. She said people have questioned her parenting. Her GoFundMe called her a racist. She's a healthcare provider, she said, someone who's spent her career caring for other people's families, and she's had to watch strangers online decide who she is based on nothing but a news cycle. She said she's leaning into her faith, into her husband, into the people who've shown up for her, because there isn't enough gratitude in the world for what that support has meant to her right now. Elmore spoke next, and where Christine's grief sounded like exhaustion, his sounded like a father still catching himself expecting his son to walk through the door. He said Nolan was the funniest one in the family. The one who worked hard because he wanted to be the best, because he wanted to make his parents proud, and they were proud of him, he said, not for what he accomplished but for who he was while he was doing it. He said Nolan never met a stranger, he couldn't turn into a friend eventually. That people were just drawn to him when he walked into a room, in a way he couldn't fully explain and didn't need to. He talked about football practice, about getting texts with 3 or 4 videos of Nolan running a route, making a block, asking his dad what he thought, and Elmore always telling him the truth, because that's what he believed a father owes a son. Not flattery. Honesty, delivered with love, because everyone else in Nolan's life would tell him what he wanted to hear, and Elmore wanted to be the one person who told him what he needed to know instead. He'll never get that text again. That's the sentence sitting underneath everything else he said. Every act of this story, every hour of forensic testimony, every boat timeline and phone log and comment thread exists because a father is never getting another video of his son making a play on a field he'll never stand on again. What both of them kept returning to in different words is that the story being told about their son doesn't match the son they knew. They said it directly, the things being said about what happened, about who Nolan was, about how he supposedly behaved that night, isn't the character of the person they raised. They know their son. They know he could do things that surprise them sometimes, the way any 18-year-old can. But what they're hearing now doesn't sound like Nolan to them, and a parent knows the difference between their child making a mistake and their child being erased and rewritten by people who never met him. That's the emotional center this entire investigation orbits, even in the moments when it doesn't look like it. Every red mark on an autopsy report, every missing hyoid bone, every deleted Snapchat and unexplained boat timeline, all of it is, at its core, an attempt to close the distance between what actually happened to Nolan and the version of events being handed to his parents by people who weren't there and don't have to live with the answer. There's a moment, later in that same press conference, that captures the whole case in a single question. If Nolan really had chosen to stay behind on that island to talk to someone, The way some of his friends have said, wouldn't he have asked for his phone back? His car keys? Wouldn't an 18-year-old planning to make his own way home, even later that night, have held on to the two things every teenager treats as non-negotiable? Nobody's been able to answer that. Not the sheriff's early ruling. Not the independent autopsy. Not a single comment section, however many hundreds of thousands of people have tried. Christine and Elmore aren't asking anyone to assume the worst about the people Nolan was with that day. They've said as much themselves. Whatever happened, happened, and they'll accept whatever the truth turns out to be. What they won't accept is silence standing in for an answer. What they won't accept is an investigation that decided how the story ends before it had finished asking the questions. Every part of this case that feels technical, the lividity, the toxicology, the GPS pings, exists in service of one plain, unbearable sentence a mother said out loud in front of a room full of cameras. She just wants to know what happened to her son. There's something worth naming about what grief looks like when it has to become public before it's even had time to become private. Most parents who lose a child get to fall apart quietly on their own terms, surrounded by people who knew their kid before any of this happened. Christine and Elmore had to do their falling apart in front of a podium, with microphones catching every pause, because privacy is a luxury this case never gave them the option of keeping. That's not a side effect of the story. It's part of what the story actually costs the people living inside it. Think about what it means to have to defend your parenting to strangers while you're still absorbing the fact that your son is gone. To have your GoFundMe scrutinized like a court exhibit. To be called a racist by people who've never met you, while you're also the person who has to keep waking up every morning and deciding to keep fighting anyway. That's not resilience in the inspiring, soundbite sense people like to reach for. It's closer to survival under conditions nobody should have to survive. And they've done it, publicly, week after week, because the alternative, going quiet, letting the first explanation stand unchallenged, would have meant giving up on ever finding out what actually happened to their son. That's the frame worth carrying into everything that follows in this script. Every forensic detail, every timeline discrepancy, every panel of experts arguing about lividity and hyoid bones. All of it is happening because two parents refused to accept silence as an answer. Whatever this case turns out to be, that refusal is already real, already documented, and already costing them more than most people watching from home will ever fully understand. There's a particular kind of strength in choosing to keep speaking, when speaking has only ever brought more scrutiny, not relief. Every time Christine or Elmore steps up to a microphone, they're handing the public another opportunity to question them, another news cycle where their parenting gets picked apart by people who've never met their son. They keep doing it anyway, not because it's gotten easier, but because the alternative, going silent, letting the sheriff's first 60 minutes stand as the final word, was never something either of them could actually live with. That's not a small thing to carry week after week, in front of an audience that includes both genuine support and genuine cruelty in roughly equal measure. There's a particular kind of loneliness in that position that's worth naming directly because it rarely gets acknowledged in coverage that focuses mostly on the case itself. Christine and Elmore are, in a real sense, doing this alone, even surrounded by attorneys, supporters, and a national audience. No amount of public sympathy replaces the two people who actually knew their son before any of this happened, the ones who could sit with them in the specific, private grief of missing him rather than the public grief of fighting for him. Those two things aren't the same, and a family forced to spend most of its energy on the public fight often has less left over for the private one, the one that doesn't come with cameras or comment sections, the one that's arguably the harder work in the long run. That's a cost this case has extracted from Christine and Elmore that will likely outlast whatever the eventual determination turns out to be, whether Mississippi authorities ever fully reckon with it or not. It's worth naming plainly one more time before this script moves on. Whatever answer eventually comes, however this case resolves, two parents did everything in their power to make sure their son was never allowed to become a footnote. Somewhere between the first press conference and this sentence, a case that started as a local missing person report turned into something else entirely, a story that hundreds of thousands of people who never met Nolan Wells have decided is, somehow, also theirs. It's worth asking why. Not to dismiss it. To actually understand it. Scroll through the comment section under any video about this case, and you'll find almost no consensus about what happened. What you'll find instead is a kind of chorus. Thousands of individual voices, most of them disagreeing with each other on the details, but nearly all of them singing the same underlying note. They don't believe what they've been told so far. Not because they have better information than the investigators. Because they've watched this particular story play out before, in other places with other names, and they recognize the shape of it before the ending's even written. Some of them go looking for that shape explicitly. In the days after Nolan's death, before any autopsy, before any press conference, people were already pulling up other names. Cases of young black men whose deaths got called accidents fast, whose investigations moved slow, whose families spent months or years trying to get answers that should have taken weeks. Nobody claims those cases are identical to Nolan's. What they're doing is something more specific than that, and more troubling if you sit with it. They're pattern matching. And a pattern only exists because it's happened enough times to be recognizable. Ben Crump himself made that same move at the podium, and it's worth noting he did it carefully. He didn't say Nolan Wells died the way Emmett Till did. He said the NAACP stood up for Emmett Till decades ago, and stood up for Medgar Evers after that, and now they're standing up for Nolan. 3 different deaths, 3 different decades, connected not by circumstance but by the fact that in each case, a community had to demand an investigation that should have happened automatically. That's not conspiracy thinking. That's institutional memory, and it's the kind of memory that doesn't fade just because the people carrying it weren't alive for the earlier chapters. There's a phrase that kept surfacing across every panel, every press conference, every comment thread pulling this story forward. Equal justice. Not special treatment. Not a guilty verdict handed out in advance. Just the version of scrutiny that, as more than one person pointed out, seems to appear automatically when the circumstances are reversed, when it's a young black man who came back from a boat without a white friend, rather than the other way around. Nobody arguing that point is claiming to know what happened to Nolan. They're pointing at a double standard in how quickly certain explanations get accepted, and how slowly certain investigations move once the easy explanation is questioned. That's the real engine behind a comment section like this one. Not bloodlust, not entertainment, even though true crime as a genre gets accused of both constantly, sometimes fairly. What's actually happening in these threads late at night is closer to a kind of collective vigilance. People who've watched official statements move fast toward accident and slow toward answers are doing, in public, in real time, the thing they wish the people with actual authority had done first, asking the next question instead of accepting the first one. It would be dishonest to pretend that vigilance is always careful. It isn't. Somewhere in the same threads that raised legitimate, specific concerns about a missing hyoid bone, there are also comments naming people who've never been charged with anything, assigning guilt with a confidence no piece of evidence actually supports. That's the failure mode of a chorus this large. When enough people are shouting the same fear at once, it's easy to mistake volume for certainty. The honest version of this story has to hold both truths at once, that the distrust driving this case forward is broadly earned, and that individual pieces of speculation inside it are not automatically true just because enough people repeat them. What almost nobody in these comment sections is doing, though, is asking whether Nolan Wells mattered. That question, somehow, is the one thing everyone's already answered. A boy is dead at 18. Whatever the manner and cause turn out to be, accident, misadventure, something else entirely, his parents are still standing in front of cameras asking a question that should have a simple answer by now and doesn't. Strangers on the internet don't owe Nolan Wells anything. The fact that so many of them have shown up anyway, night after night, thread after thread, says something about what people are actually asking for when they ask for an investigation to be taken seriously. It's not a verdict they want. It's the thing his mother asked for in that room, stripped down to its simplest form. Somebody to look all the way through before deciding what the story is. It's worth asking, too, why some cases catch like this and others don't. Every year, families lose children in accidents on the water, in cars, in homes, under circumstances nobody outside their immediate community ever hears about. The forensic uncertainty in those cases isn't smaller. The grief isn't lighter. What's usually different is timing, visibility, and whether a detail exists that's specific enough to catch on, a video, a missing item, a sentence in an official statement that doesn't hold up under a second look. Nolan's case had all three. The 2:23 p.m. video gave people something to watch, rewind, and study. The missing throat gave people something concrete enough to argue about, instead of an abstract sense that something felt off. And no foul play arrived early enough and confidently enough that it created its own contradiction the moment the second autopsy came back undetermined instead of confirming it. That's not a criticism of the people paying attention. It's an observation about how attention itself works, and it cuts in an uncomfortable direction if you sit with it. If virality is partly a matter of which cases happen to have the right ingredients, a viral clip, accountable discrepancy, an official misstep specific enough to quote, then there are almost certainly other Nolan Wellses out there right now, cases with the same shape and the same unanswered questions that never got the video, never got the reward money, never got a room full of national reporters asking follow-up questions. This case became a chorus because the conditions happened to be right for one to form. That doesn't make the chorus wrong to exist. It should make everyone inside it a little uneasy about how much of the outcome, for any family in this position, still comes down to luck. If there's a responsibility that comes with being part of a chorus this large, it's this: using the attention while it's here to push for something that outlasts the attention itself. Cases like this one tend to have a lifespan measured in weeks before the algorithm moves everyone's focus elsewhere, whether or not the underlying questions have been answered. The value of a chorus isn't just the noise it makes in the moment. It's whether that noise translates into something structural before it fades, a policy changed, a review board convened, a precedent set that the next family in this exact position won't have to fight this hard just to be taken seriously from the start. That's the version of this story worth hoping for. Not just an answer for Nolan Wells, as urgently as one is needed, but a system that stops requiring a viral moment before it does its job properly the first time. There's a version of this chorus that fades the moment the next case takes its place in the feed, and there's a version that leaves something behind. The difference between them usually comes down to whether anyone watching turns attention into something more durable than a comment, a letter to an elected official, a donation to the family's legal fund, a phone call to the tip line with information that's been sitting unshared for weeks. Millions of people typing the same frustration into the same comment box is a genuine signal. It is not on its own pressure that an institution has to respond to. Pressure requires follow-through, and follow-through is the one thing a comment section, by its nature, can't provide on its own. That's not a criticism of anyone who's shown up for this case in whatever way they could. It's a reminder that the chorus is loudest right now, in this exact window, and what happens to Nolan Wells' case 6 months from now will depend less on how loud that chorus was today than on how many of the people inside it were still paying attention once the volume naturally started to drop. Attention like that has a shelf life, and it's worth being honest about how short it usually is. Most viral cases have a natural lifespan measured in weeks, not months, and Nolan Wells' case is already well past the point where most stories like it would have quietly faded from the feed entirely. That it hasn't yet says something real about how deeply the unanswered questions here have lodged themselves in people who have no personal stake in the outcome beyond basic human concern. But shelf life is still shelf life. Every week that passes without a genuine update, without a new piece of confirmed information, is a week where the algorithm's incentive to keep surfacing the story to new viewers weakens a little further. That's not a criticism of anyone watching. It's simply how attention behaves online, regardless of how much a given case deserves to be remembered. Which is exactly why the 4 remaining pieces, the toxicology, the throat, the boat's record, and the phone's missing day, matter on a timeline that has almost nothing to do with the legal process itself. Every one of them released while this audience is still large and still paying attention does more real-world work than the same release would do 6 months from now. Once the story is cooled, and the audience willing to actually absorb new information has shrunk to a fraction of what it is tonight. That's an uncomfortable truth about how public accountability actually functions in this era, but it's the honest one, and it's part of why this case's outcome may end up depending as much on timing as it does on the underlying facts themselves. If you're one of the people still paying attention this far in, that's exactly who this channel is for. Subscribe now, because the next stretch of the story is where the families fight, the second forensic opinion, and the boat's own timeline all collide. So here's where this actually sits, stripped of everything but what's confirmed. A boy went to Horn Island on the 4th of July. He was seen on video at 2:23 in the afternoon, alive, laughing, no shirt on. By that evening, he was gone. Within an hour of his body being found, an official called it accidental, before a single autopsy had been performed. Weeks later, a second, independent autopsy came back with a different word for it. Undetermined. That word is doing more work than it looks like it's doing. It's not a shrug. It's not investigators throwing up their hands. Undetermined means the evidence that exists doesn't rule out an accident, and doesn't rule out something else, and anyone telling you with total confidence which one it was, in either direction, is telling you more than the people who actually examined Nolan's body are willing to say. What's confirmed? A red discoloration on the back of his skull with no clear explanation. A missing set of throat structures that would have answered one of the most important questions in the entire case, being examined by someone who isn't required to say when or whether those results become public. A last video showing him without a shirt and a body recovered from the water in exactly that condition. No contradiction there. Whatever got repeated online. A day of missing phone activity that has at least one innocent explanation and at least one uncomfortable one, and no public confirmation yet of which is true. A boat that called for help, then kept moving for hours afterward, on a timeline nobody official has walked through in public. What's not confirmed? Almost everything else. Not who was with him in his final hour. Not whether he entered the water on his own. Not what the toxicology report will say whenever it finally comes back. Not whether anyone did anything to him at all. That gap, between what's confirmed and what's still just a question, is where this story has lived since the day it started, and it's where two other families, watching from a distance, recognize something they'd already lived through themselves. Daniel Irvin's mother, watching her son's death get explained away by two friends who threw out his phone and his clothes and erased months of messages before anyone official asked them a single question. Tyler Smith's mother and grandmother, told that a gunshot residue test wasn't even necessary because the explanation they'd already been given was treated as good enough to stop looking further. Neither case proves what happened to Nolan. Both of them prove that this pattern has a name, and it isn't new. If there's a single sentence that holds the whole story together, it isn't anything a medical examiner said, and it isn't anything read off a report at a podium. It's simpler than that, and it belongs to a mother who stood in front of a room full of cameras and said the only question she has is what happened to her son. Every act since then, every panel, every timeline, every comment section lit up at 2 in the morning, has been an attempt, imperfect and incomplete, to actually answer her. Nobody has yet. The toxicology report isn't back. The throat structures haven't been released. The Mississippi medical examiner's own findings still haven't been made public, weeks after Nolan's body was recovered. Until one of those things changes, undetermined is the most honest word anyone can offer his family, and it's not enough. And everyone covering this case, including the people telling you this story right now, knows it isn't enough. If you have information about what happened to Nolan Xavier Wells, anything, however small it seems, there are people actively trying to hear it. A tip line exists for exactly that reason. Somebody out there knows something. That's been true since the first week of this case, and it's still true tonight. Until there's an answer, this isn't over. It doesn't get to be over. Not for his parents, not for the people who've been watching this unfold for weeks, and not for the two other families who see their own sons every time they hear his name. What happened to Nolan Wells? That's still the only question that matters. Undetermined is a strange word to build a life around, but that's exactly what this family has had to do since the moment it was read out loud. It isn't a diagnosis. It isn't a sentence. It's a placeholder, standing in for an answer that hasn't arrived yet, and placeholders are exhausting to live inside for as long as this one has already lasted. Most people only encounter a word like that in passing, a pending court case on the news, a medical test result they don't have to think about again after a follow-up appointment clears it. For Christine and Elmore, undetermined isn't a word they read once and moved past. It's the water they're treading in every single day until someone with the authority to change it actually does. That's worth remembering the next time this case scrolls past in a feed, reduced to a headline or a thumbnail. Behind the word undetermined is a specific set of parents who still don't know how their son died, sleeping in a house that still has his room in it, still getting reminders on their phones for things he was supposed to do this fall. The rest of us get to close the tab. They don't get that option. And until one of the four things still sitting unresolved, the toxicology, the throat, the boat's timeline, the phone's missing day, actually gets resolved, that won't change no matter how many news cycles pass it by. It's worth being honest about what the script itself can and can't do about that. No amount of careful narration, no amount of audience attention, no amount of comment section pressure actually opens a locked drawer or releases a toxicology report. What coverage like this can do, and the only thing it was ever really capable of doing, is keep the question loud enough for long enough that the cost of leaving it unanswered eventually exceeds the cost of finally answering it. That's a modest kind of power compared to subpoena authority or prosecutorial discretion, but it isn't nothing. Every family that's ever gotten a case reopened after it was initially closed too quickly got there, because enough attention accumulated to make continued silence more expensive than continued scrutiny. That's the actual mechanism underneath every headline, every panel, every caller dialing in at midnight to ask the same unanswered question a different way. Not magic. Just sustained, inconvenient, unglamorous pressure applied for as long as it takes. That's also, in the end, the honest answer to why a case like this gets told at this length, in this much detail, instead of in a 2-minute segment that moves on by the next news cycle. 2 minutes doesn't create pressure. 2 minutes creates a headline that people forget by the following week. What actually holds an institution's attention long enough to change its behavior is a story people keep returning to, keep asking about, keep refusing to let fade quietly into the next case's shadow. That's not a justification after the fact. It's the entire reason the story has been told the way it has, for transcripts, a comment section, a family's own words, and every unanswered thread braided together into something too substantial to simply scroll past. Nolan Wells deserved that kind of attention while he was alive. His family deserves it now, in his absence, until the day someone finally gives them the one thing this entire story has been circling from its very first sentence: an answer. No matter how many news cycles pass it by. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from having to hold two things at once, indefinitely. Grief for a son who is definitely gone, and uncertainty about a story that is definitely unfinished. Most people who lose someone get to move, eventually, from raw grief into some version of understanding, even when the understanding is painful. This family hasn't been given that second stage yet. They're stuck in the first one on a loop because the facts required to move past it are still sitting in files nobody official has opened for them. That's a specific, avoidable kind of suffering, separate from the loss itself. And it's the piece of this case that a simple word like undetermined doesn't come close to capturing. And yet, week after week, this family keeps showing up anyway, to podiums, to cameras, to reporters asking the same unanswered questions in slightly different words. That's not something to treat as background noise while waiting for a real update. It's the actual center of the story, the thing every forensic detail and timeline discrepancy ultimately orbits. A family that could have gone quiet is chosen, publicly and repeatedly, not to. That choice is its own kind of answer, even while the official one is still missing. There's a version of this case that plays out entirely differently a decade from now, and it's worth imagining it honestly, both the hopeful version and the discouraging one. In the hopeful version, the throat structures get released, the toxicology comes back, the boat's full timeline gets walked through by someone with actual subpoena power, and Nolan Wells' case becomes, years later, a reference point people cite when they talk about what a proper independent investigation is supposed to look like under public pressure. In the discouraging version, none of that happens. The story simply fades, the way so many stories do, replaced week after week by whatever case has captured the algorithm's attention next, and undetermined quietly becomes permanent by default rather than by any actual decision. Both versions are still possible right now, and which one this becomes depends less on new evidence than it does on whether the attention buildup around this case translates into anything that outlasts the attention itself. That's not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it's an honest one. Cases like this rarely get reopened by revelation. They get reopened by persistence, by people who kept asking the same question long after it stopped being convenient to keep asking it. Nolan's parents have already shown they're willing to be those people, for as long as it takes. What's still an open question is whether everyone else who's shown up for the story, the panels, the callers, the strangers typing into comment sections at 2 in the morning, are willing to keep showing up the same way, long after this particular news cycle has moved on to something else. If this script has a closing thought worth carrying past the last line, it's this: undetermined is not the same word as unimportant, and it should never be allowed to function that way in practice. A case doesn't stop mattering the moment it stops trending. It matters exactly as much the day after the cameras leave as it did the day they arrived, because the facts underneath it haven't changed. Only the amount of attention pointed at them has. What Nolan's family is asking for, in the end, isn't really about this specific case being solved on any particular timeline. It's about a standard. That attention shouldn't be the price of a thorough investigation. That should be the baseline, offered freely, to every family in this position, whether or not their case happens to catch fire online. Until that's true everywhere, stories like this one will keep needing to be told loudly, publicly, and at length. Not because loud is better than quiet, but because quiet, for too many families before this one, has meant forgotten. There's a reason two specific things sit at the center of this fight for accountability: who the family chose to examine Nolan's body, and what they've put on the table to get answers. It's worth stopping to ask a question that got skipped over in the noise of the report itself. Out of every forensic pathologist in the country, why him? Why did Nolan's family and the legal team working with them specifically go looking for Dr. Roger Mitchell? The answer is in the resume, and it's not a short one. He did his undergraduate work at Cornell Medical School at SUNY Upstate. His residency and fellowship took him through George Washington University Hospital and New York City's own office of the Chief Medical Examiner, which means before he ever ran his own office, he trained inside one of the busiest in the country. He went on to serve as Chief Medical Examiner for Washington, D.C. itself for 7 years, and briefly as the city's interim deputy mayor for public safety and justice. He's president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest organization of Black physicians in the country. He holds a tenured professorship at Howard University, where he also once served as hospital president. He's co-authored a book examining deaths that occur in police and state custody. By the time anyone at that podium opened his report, he had already personally performed thousands of autopsies. None of that makes him infallible. It does make him an unusually difficult person to dismiss. When someone with that resume tells you a case is undetermined, that's not a shrug from someone out of their depth. It's the most precise word available to someone who has spent a career learning exactly how much a body can and can't tell you. That's very likely the point. If you're a family bracing for your independent findings to be picked apart, minimized, or waved away by people who'd rather the story end quietly, you don't go looking for just any pathologist. You go looking for the one whose credentials make that dismissal harder to pull off. The reward attached to this case tells its own version of the same story. Ben Crump thanked several people by name before mentioning a number: Reverend Al Sharpton, Tyler Perry, and NFL Hall of Famer Terrell Owens among them, and the figure that followed was $125,000. Owens' own public pledge, confirmed separately, was $25,000 of that total. The math suggests the full amount is a combined pool from multiple contributors rather than one person's number, though the complete breakdown of who gave what hasn't been made public. What matters more than the exact figure is what it represents. Money doesn't solve a case on its own. What it does is change the calculation for anyone sitting on information they've been quiet about. Anyone who knows something, has said nothing, and has been telling themselves that staying silent costs them nothing. A six-figure reward is a direct answer to that math. It doesn't guarantee someone comes forward. It makes the silence a little more expensive every week it continues. Both of these threads, the pathologist whose credentials are hard to wave away, and the reward stacking higher the longer this goes unanswered, exist for the same reason. Somebody, somewhere, made a decision to spend real resources, making sure this case doesn't quietly disappear the way so many others like it have. Whether that effort gets Nolan Wells' family an actual answer is still, like everything else in the story, undetermined. But it is, at minimum, an answer to a different question, the one about whether anyone was going to keep looking after the cameras moved on. There's a reason credentials matter as much as they do in a case like this one, and it isn't snobbery. It's that credentials function as a kind of currency in exactly the situation this family found themselves in, a situation where trust in the official process had already been spent down to almost nothing within the first hour. When an institution's first move is a premature, no foul play, the people trying to get past that have to bring something that can't be waved away as easily as a press release can. A resume with thousands of autopsies behind it, a former chief medical examiner's office, a body of published, peer-reviewed work. That's not theater. That's the only kind of counterweight heavy enough to make a dismissive institution think twice before dismissing the findings that come out of it. The same logic applies to the reward. Money alone doesn't produce truth. But in a case where the official channels have already shown they're willing to move fast toward a conclusion and slow toward evidence, a six-figure incentive is one of the few tools available to private citizens that can actually shift behavior on a timeline faster than institutional process usually allows. It's an imperfect tool. It can attract bad information as easily as good. But it's one of the only levers a family without subpoena power actually has, and far short of that basic obligation the normal process has already fallen. Families shouldn't need a private legal team functioning as an informal second investigation just to get the same treatment any case is supposed to receive by default. That an independent effort of this scale was necessary at all is itself a quiet indictment of the process it was built to work around. Far short the normal process has already fallen. Think about what it says that a family has to essentially build its own parallel investigation, hire its own pathologist, fund its own reward, rely on its own legal team to extract information a public office should be volunteering freely. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. The existence of an independent autopsy, a privately funded reward, and a legal team functioning almost like a second investigative agency isn't a sign that the system is working as intended with extra support layered on top. It's a sign that the primary system failed to earn this family's trust quickly enough for them to rely on it alone. Every dollar raised, every credential assembled, every hour spent building this parallel effort is, in a very real sense, the cost of an institution's first 60 minutes of premature certainty. That's an expensive mistake to have made, and it's one this family is still paying for, in time and money and grief. Every single week this case remains unresolved. There's an irony worth sitting with here, too. The very system that responded to Nolan's death with a rushed, premature conclusion is the same system that would, under different circumstances, be fully capable of matching Dr. Mitchell's expertise, matching the reward's urgency, matching the scrutiny this case has finally received. Nothing about a thorough, well-resourced investigation is beyond an official medical examiner's office or a county sheriff's department. They do it constantly for cases that draw far less attention than this one. What's missing isn't capability. It's the will to apply that capability here at this speed for this family without needing a national spotlight to force the issue. That gap between what the system can do and what it chose to do first is, in its own way, the most damning detail in this entire case, more than any single forensic finding, because it's the one thing that was entirely within someone's control from the very first hour. There's a broader reckoning buried inside that single missed hour, one that extends well past this particular sheriff's department or this particular county. Every institution that touches a case like this, local law enforcement, a district attorney's office, a state medical examiner, makes a choice, consciously or not, about how much initial benefit of the doubt to extend toward the easiest available explanation. That choice rarely gets examined in the moment it's made. It only becomes visible in hindsight, once a second look reveals how much was assumed rather than established. Nolan Wells' case has become, whether anyone intended it to or not, a visible example of exactly that choice being made in real time, on camera, in a matter of minutes, with consequences that are still unfolding weeks later. That visibility is uncomfortable for the institutions involved, and it should be because discomfort is often the only thing that actually changes how those institutions behave going forward. Nobody covering this case is asking for perfection from an overworked sheriff's department handling a chaotic scene on a holiday weekend. What's being asked for is something far more modest, an acknowledgement that no foul play is a conclusion, not a starting assumption, and that conclusions like that one should come after the looking, not before it. Whatever else this case ends up teaching anyone watching it, that single distinction between investigating first and concluding first might end up being the most durable lesson of all, applicable to the next case just as much as to this one. So the man and the money aren't really the story here. They're the receipts for the actual story, the proof of what it costs when the system's default response has to be overridden by outside pressure before it does what it should have done automatically. Every other family without the resources, the connections, or the public attention to build that same parallel effort doesn't get a Dr. Mitchell or a six-figure reward. They get whatever the first 60 minutes decided, and then usually silence. That's the part of this case worth remembering long after the specific findings are settled one way or another. Not just what happened to Nolan Wells, but how much had to be built from scratch by two grieving parents just to get the basic fairness every family should expect by default. None of that context existed yet in the room where this all started. Before there was a reward, before there was a second forensic opinion, there was simply a podium, a family, and a room full of reporters with questions. Once the report itself had been read out loud, the floor opened to reporters, and for a few minutes, the tone in that room shifted from prepared statement to something raw. The first question came fast, and it was the obvious one. With this much information, this many pages, this much forensic language, what should people actually take away from it? A member of the family's own legal team answered by going back to basics. 3 things mattered above everything else. The unexplained discoloration at the back of the head, the absence of the throat structures, and the open question of why they were held back. And the thing underlying both of those, nobody yet knows what condition Nolan was in the moment he entered the water. Conscious or not, forced or not. Everything else in the report, she said, is detail hanging off those 3 points. A reporter from a Chicago outlet asked something more pointed. What, exactly, were they calling for from Mississippi authorities? Not vague transparency. Specifics. The answer came back sharp. A fair, impartial, comprehensive investigation, the same one they believe should have started the moment Nolan's body was found, instead of a sheriff's office announcing no foul play before a single interview had taken place. That sequence, more than anything else, is what the family's team says cost them the benefit of the doubt early. You don't get to call it an accident and then start investigating. The investigating has to come first. There's a specific comparison that got made in that room, and it's worth repeating carefully because it's the whole argument in miniature. If the 3 other teenagers on that trip had been black, and the one who ended up dead had been white, does anyone in this room genuinely believe those 3 teenagers would have been allowed to lawyer up, decline comment, and go about their lives while an investigation dragged on for weeks? Or would they have been held, questioned, their phones seized and searched, until every account matched up? Nobody in that room offered an answer, because the answer was the entire point of asking. Then came the question that actually cracked the room open a little. A reporter asked Nolan's mother directly for a timeline, every point of contact she'd had with local authorities since her son's body was found. Was it radio silence? Did she have to chase them? What did that actually look like, day to day? Christine answered it plainly, and it's worth hearing in full because it's the most concrete accounting of how this case has actually been handled that's ever been made public. The last time she spoke with the sheriff's department was a day or 2 after Nolan's body was recovered, and that contact only happened because she initiated it. She texted him herself, introduced herself as Nolan's mother, asked if there was anything new. He called her back. There wasn't anything new. They were still interviewing people, he told her. What stuck with her, she said, wasn't the lack of updates. It was the timing of what came before it. Less than an hour after her son's body had been removed from where it was found, the sheriff was already telling the public it looked like an accidental drowning, that there didn't appear to be foul play. Not after interviews. Not after an autopsy. Within the hour. She said she'd asked him, directly, to treat this the way he'd treat it if it were his own child. He told her he would. But a statement like that, made that fast, does damage that a later promise can't undo. She met with the district attorney too, and was told, essentially, that isn't how things work in her office, that no premature conclusions had actually been reached. Christine's response to that was simple. The damage isn't about intent. It's about what the public already believes by the time anyone tries to correct the record. That's the piece that doesn't get talked about enough when this case comes up. It's not only about what the evidence eventually shows. It's about a narrative that got said in the first 60 minutes and has been nearly impossible to fully dislodge since, no matter how many undetermined findings come out afterward. Crump added the detail that's followed this case everywhere it's gone since. 300 to 400 people were on that island that day. Not 3 or 4. Hundreds. And in all that time, across all those people, nobody official has produced a single account that actually explains how Nolan Wells ended up alone. He raised, again, the detail about Nolan supposedly choosing to stay behind to talk to someone, and the same question that keeps resurfacing every time this case gets discussed. If that was really the plan, if he meant to make his own way back later that night, wouldn't he have kept his phone? His car keys? The two things any 18-year-old holds onto without thinking twice, precisely because you never plan for the night you'll actually need them. Nobody in that room had an answer. That silence said more than any individual response could have. A room full of trained reporters, people whose job is to press for specifics, had nothing to press with because the question wasn't rhetorical. It was a genuine gap nobody present could fill, and everybody in that room knew at the moment it was asked. The chant that followed, "Justice for Nolan Wells," repeated by dozens of voices until it filled the room, wasn't a demand for a specific verdict. It was the sound of a room full of people who'd just listened to every unanswered question stack up one after another, deciding out loud that stacking wasn't good enough anymore. There's something worth sitting with in the detail of that first text message Christine sent to the sheriff. Not the phone call that came after it. The text itself, a mother typing out, "Hey, this is Christine, Nolan's mom. I just want to see if there are any updates," because the alternative was sitting at home, waiting, with no idea whether anyone official was still actively working her son's case at all. That's not how this is supposed to work. Families aren't supposed to have to initiate contact with investigators to find out whether their child's case is being taken seriously. They're supposed to be updated proactively, as a matter of basic practice. The fact that Christine had to reach out first, and that reaching out only produced "we're still interviewing," tells you something about the baseline level of communication this family has been working with from the very beginning, and it's a baseline that makes every other frustration in this case, the missing throat, the undetermined report, the silence from Mississippi, land a little harder, because it's clearly not an isolated failure. It's a pattern that started on day one and never really stopped. Contrast that baseline with what a well-resourced, well-connected family might have experienced in the same circumstances, a dedicated liaison checking in daily, updates delivered before they had to be requested, a communication plan built around the assumption that grief shouldn't also require detective work just to stay informed. That's not a hypothetical drawn from nowhere. It's the standard plenty of public institutions are capable of providing when they decide a case, or a family, warrants it. The gap between that standard and what Christine actually received, a single return text, a promise that came only after she pushed for one, is its own kind of evidence. Not evidence about what happened to Nolan. Evidence about how seriously this case was taken before public pressure forced anyone to take it more seriously than that first hour suggested they intended to. It's worth remembering that press conferences like this one aren't really built for the family's benefit, even when a family is the one standing at the podium. They're built to apply exactly the kind of pressure Christine shouldn't have had to generate herself with a single unanswered text. Every reporter's question, every camera in that room, every clip that gets clipped and reposted afterward, functions as a substitute for the proactive communication that should have existed from day one. That's the quiet irony sitting underneath this entire press conference. A family had to build a public spectacle, with national media and a room full of strangers chanting their son's name, just to receive the basic level of engagement that should have been available to them privately, through an ordinary phone call, from the very beginning. It's worth imagining for a moment what this same press conference would have looked like if it had never needed to happen at all. A family doesn't call a national press conference because they enjoy the spotlight. They call one because every quieter, more private channel has already failed them. Somewhere in an alternate version of this story, Christine gets a call back the same day she reaches out, not 2 days later, and only after she initiates contact herself. Somewhere in that version, the throat structures come with an explanation attached before anyone has to ask why they're missing. Somewhere in that version, this family never has to stand in front of a room full of cameras just to be taken seriously. That version of the story doesn't exist, and the reason it doesn't is worth sitting with as its own finding, separate from anything forensic. The system had every opportunity to make a press conference like this one unnecessary. It didn't take that opportunity, and everything that followed, the media attention, the reward, the competing pathologists, exists because of that first missed chance, not in spite of it. The reporters in that room weren't the only ones with questions. Once the story moved to television, the questions kept coming, this time from ordinary people watching at home. Somewhere in the middle of the expert panel discussing Dr. Mitchell's report, the broadcast opened its phone lines, and for a while, the story stopped being about credentialed experts and became about ordinary people who couldn't stop thinking about a boy they'd never met. The first caller barely made it through his question. He was calling from Clarksville, Tennessee, and he apologized more than once for getting emotional before he'd even finished a sentence. His question, underneath the emotion, was simple. Do you think they're just waiting for this story to lose momentum before they quietly release whatever they've been sitting on? And when he got to the missing throat, the fact that a second independent pathologist never even got to examine it, his voice caught. He said he was enraged. Not confused. Enraged. Neither expert on the panel would hand him the answer he seemed to want. Not because they didn't understand why he was asking. Because they genuinely didn't have enough information to call it a cover-up, and saying so anyway would have been exactly the kind of unearned certainty this case has already suffered from in the other direction. What they offered instead was more honest, if less satisfying. It's possible that investigators on both sides are holding their findings close, each one waiting to see what the other reveals first, before committing to anything public. That's not proof of concealment. It's just what caution looks like from the outside, and caution and concealment can look identical to a grieving public with no way to tell them apart. One of the panelists made a point that's easy to miss in the moment, but worth holding on to. She said she doesn't automatically trust official investigations where Black lives are involved, not because of where this happened, but because of what the data shows nationally, in every state, in every city. That distrust isn't regional. It isn't really even about Mississippi specifically. It's a baseline that gets applied everywhere, adjusted only by how quickly or how slowly a given case works to earn its way back out of it. A second caller, a woman who'd clearly been following the story from another angle entirely, brought up something she'd heard elsewhere about the boat and its GPS, details she attributed to a different broadcast covering the case. What followed was a small, almost funny moment in an otherwise heavy hour. The host had to gently explain that the towboat details she was describing weren't new. They'd already been reported, already been explained, nearly 2 weeks earlier. A bilge pump that failed, a call to a towing service, the boat going back out later that same window to collect other people who'd been left behind on the island. Nolan wasn't on that later trip. It was a reminder that even verified, boring, non-mysterious explanations for one detail can circulate online sounding like a brand new revelation, simply because different audiences are hearing it for the first time on different channels, days or weeks apart. The last caller of that stretch asked the question that might be the most reasonable one in this entire case, and the hardest to answer well. If toxicology is the only piece that genuinely takes weeks or months, why can't the physical findings, the parts that don't require lab time at all, be shared with the public, or at least with the family, right away? Why the blanket silence on everything, instead of transparency on the parts that are actually ready? Neither expert had a clean answer for that either, and, to their credit, neither pretended to. What they agreed on, though, cuts against a lot of the angrier theories circulating in the comments underneath every video about this case. Nobody outside this investigation actually knows what has or hasn't already been shared privately with Nolan's family. The public silence isn't necessarily the family's silence. It's entirely possible, likely even, that Christine and Elmore know more tonight than anyone watching a broadcast does, and that the gap between what's public and what's private is simply larger than most people covering this case, including the people telling you this story right now, are able to see from the outside. That distinction matters. It's the difference between a family being kept in the dark and a public being kept, for now, at arm's length from information that's still moving through channels nobody outside the investigation can follow. Both are frustrating. They are not the same thing, and conflating them is exactly how a story like this one drifts from legitimate scrutiny into something less accurate than it needs to be. There's something almost strange about the existence of a call-in segment for a case like this one at all, if you step back and think about what it represents. A grieving family's loss has become something strangers can phone in about, live On air, the same way people call in with questions about a recipe or a home repair. That could read as exploitative, and in the wrong hands, it probably would be. What made these particular calls feel like something else, something closer to a town hall than a spectacle, is that almost nobody who phoned in was performing outrage for its own sake. They were doing something closer to what a neighborhood does when a child goes missing, showing up, asking the obvious questions nobody official seems to be answering, and refusing to let the conversation move on just because the segment technically ended. A call-in line shouldn't have to function as an extension of an investigation. In this case, for better or worse, it's become one anyway, because the actual investigation hasn't given people much else to hold on to. What's striking listening back through calls like these is how rarely anyone asked for something extreme. Nobody phoned in demanding an arrest. Nobody asked the panel to name a guilty party on air. What they asked for, call after call, was smaller and harder to argue with. An explanation. A timeline. A reason the throat wasn't sent along with the rest of the body. A sense that someone somewhere was actually accountable for answering these questions rather than simply absorbing them and moving on to the next headline. That's a strikingly modest set of demands for a case that's generated this much national attention, and it says something worth sitting with, that the anger driving this story forward isn't really about wanting someone punished. It's about wanting anyone in a position of authority to take it as seriously as the people calling in already have. That's an important thing to hold on to, because it cuts against the easiest criticism of true crime coverage generally, that it thrives on outrage for its own sake. Listen to an actual hour of callers on a case like this one, and what comes through more than outrage is something closer to bewilderment. Ordinary people trying to apply ordinary logic to a situation that keeps refusing to resolve into anything ordinary. A missing organ. A boat that circled back. A phone with a hole in its timeline. None of those things on their own are exotic. What's exotic is that all of them are sitting in the same case, unexplained at the same time, and it's that accumulation more than any single detail that keeps pulling people to a phone to ask, on live television, whether anyone official even notices. That bewilderment is worth taking seriously as its own kind of data point, separate from anything a caller specifically alleges. When enough ordinary people, with no stake in the outcome beyond basic human concern, look at the same set of facts and independently arrive at the same sense that something doesn't add up, that's not proof of wrongdoing. But it's not nothing either. It's closer to a smoke detector than a verdict, a signal that something in the air is worth investigating further, even if it eventually turns out to have an innocent source. Dismissing that signal outright, the way official statements in this case did from the very first hour, is its own kind of mistake. Taking it seriously enough to actually look, without assuming it proves anything in advance, is the only response that respects both the family asking for answers and the truth, whatever it eventually turns out to be. Underneath every caller's question was the same body, the same unresolved image that started this entire case. There's a photograph at the center of this case that almost nobody covering it has actually shown their audience, out of basic respect for Nolan and his family. But several people who've seen it have described it in detail, on air, and those descriptions matter, because they raise a question the written autopsy report doesn't fully resolve on its own. He was found at the shoreline, right where the water meets the sand, face down. His left foot resting on a patch of kelp that had washed up nearby. One leg bent outward, the other extended. His arm out and down at his side, the way someone sleeps when they've fallen asleep on their stomach. His head turned to one side into the sand. No shirt. No shoes. Nothing visible on his wrists. No watch. Nothing that would have separated him from the description already on file with the missing persons report, the same description that matched the last video anyone has of him. One broadcast host, describing that photograph live, made an argument that sounds almost too simple to be wrong. If he was lying face down, how could blood have pooled at the back of his head? Gravity pulls blood toward whatever surface a body is resting against after death. Face down, that would mean the front of the body, not the back of the skull, where Dr. Mitchell's report placed the unexplained discoloration. It's a fair question, and it's exactly the kind of question a forensic pathologist is trained to answer with more nuance than a photograph alone can offer. The response, from a different medical examiner watching the same report, was that the position a body is found in on a beach isn't necessarily the position it stayed in for the hours or days afterward. Whenever the original autopsy concluded, the body would have been placed on its back for that examination. It would have been placed on its back again for transport to Washington, D.C. for the second one. Blood can continue settling in a body for some time after death, particularly if the areas where it's pooling haven't had a chance to fix in place yet, and even after they have fixed, further pooling can still occur depending on how the body continues to be moved and handled. That answer doesn't resolve the question. So much is relocated. It's not enough to know how he was found. You'd need to know exactly how he was handled, moved, and positioned at every stage between recovery and both autopsies to say with confidence whether that discoloration reflects where he died, or simply where gravity worked on him afterward. Nobody outside the investigation currently has that full accounting. That's the honest, if unsatisfying, place this particular thread of the case actually sits. There's a second layer to this same argument that's easy to miss the first time through. The pathologist who examined the body twice, Dr. Mitchell, never used the word hemorrhage in his own report. He called it a reddened area. That's a deliberate distinction, not a casual one. Hemorrhage implies active bleeding from a living body. A reddened area is something looser, and it can be produced by several different processes entirely unrelated to trauma, including, as more than one expert pointed out, the simple breakdown of muscle tissue that happens during decomposition, independent of blood movement at all. What nobody disputes, across every version of this conversation, is what wasn't found alongside it. No fracture in the skull beneath the discoloration. No laceration, abrasion, or bruise on the skin above it. And skin injuries, unlike deep tissue changes, tend to remain visible even in a body that's decomposed significantly. If there had been a real blow to the back of Nolan's head, most experts agree you'd expect some trace of it on the surface, not just underneath. Its absence doesn't rule out trauma. It complicates the case for it. A trial attorney weighing in on the same broadcast pushed the conversation somewhere it hadn't gone yet, using a case from an entirely different kind of death to make his point. He described an arson investigation where the determination of homicide didn't come from the fire itself. Fire destroys almost everything that could prove intent on its own. It came from what surrounded it. A man who'd moved his family photographs and his important documents out of the house the day before it burned, but left his wife's belongings behind. A phone call to his insurance company asking, specifically, whether a fire would be covered before the fire had happened. None of that was visible in the wreckage. All of it was what actually proved what happened. The point he was making applies directly to Nolan's case, whether or not you agree with where it leads. A body can only tell you so much on its own, especially a body that spent time in warm water and days waiting for a second examination. The rest of the story, the reddened area's true cause, whether it means anything at all, may never come from the autopsy table. It may come, if it comes at all, from everything happening around it. The timeline, the digital trail, the accounts of the people who were there and haven't yet said much of anything. There's a useful way to think about the limits of what a body alone can tell you, and it has nothing to do with medicine. Reading an autopsy report without the surrounding investigation is a little like reading the last few pages of a novel with every earlier chapter torn out. You can tell something happened. You can often tell roughly how it ended. What you can't do, no matter how carefully you study those final pages, is reconstruct the motive, the decisions, the moments that actually led there, because that information was never in the ending to begin with. It was in the chapters nobody's handed over yet. That's the honest limitation every expert on every panel discussing this case has run into, in their own words, from their own angle. The body can describe what happened to it. It cannot, on its own, explain why. For that, you need everything the body's own report was never going to be able to provide, and right now that everything is still sitting scattered across phone records, boat logs, and the memories of 300 or 400 people who were on that island and haven't yet been asked, formally on the record, to account for what they saw. It's worth remembering, too, that experts disagreeing with each other isn't a weakness in this case. It's what honest forensic science actually looks like from the outside. A single pathologist offering total certainty about an ambiguous finding would be a red flag, not a reassurance. Real experts hedge precisely because the evidence in front of them genuinely supports more than one explanation. What should trouble people watching this case isn't that Dr. Mitchell and Dr. Crowns read the same findings slightly differently. It's that nobody with more complete information, the original medical examiner, the state's own investigators, has stepped forward to narrow that disagreement with the one thing that could actually resolve it: their own findings made public, compared directly against the second autopsies. Two experts working from limited information disagreeing is normal science. One side with more complete information staying silent while that disagreement plays out for a national audience is something else entirely. Picture how differently this entire conversation would sound if the original medical examiner's findings were simply released alongside the second autopsies. Every debate about lividity versus trauma, every disagreement over what the reddened area might mean, every hedge and qualifier from every expert on every panel, all of it could be checked immediately against a set of first-hand observations made while Nolan's body was still fresh from recovery. That's not a radical demand. It's the ordinary function of transparency in exactly the kind of high-profile, high-scrutiny case that demands it most. Instead, the public has been left comparing two incomplete readings of the same evidence, filling the space between them with speculation that a single released document could resolve in minutes. That gap isn't a mystery of forensic science. It's a choice, made and remade every day this case continues, by whoever currently holds the missing half of the picture. That body, and everything argued about it, still can't account for something simpler: the last hour anyone can actually place Nolan in. There's one name that surfaces in the accounts of that day, and then almost disappears again just as fast: Katie. According to the friends who were with Nolan on Horn Island, the reason he stayed behind when the boat left wasn't confusion, and it wasn't an accident of timing. He told them he wanted to keep talking to a girl. Her name, as it's been relayed since, was Katie. That's the explanation that's been offered for why an 18-year-old let a boat leave without him in the first place. Not that he was left behind, but that he chose to stay, at least for a little while longer, to finish a conversation. For a brief stretch after Nolan went missing, there was real confusion about whether Katie herself needed to be found too. Nobody searching for Nolan seemed to actually know who she was. No last name that circulated widely. No clear way to reach her. That absence turned into its own small mystery alongside the larger one. If the friend's account depended on a specific person being there with him, and nobody could locate that person to confirm any part of the story, what exactly was anyone supposed to make of it? The confusion resolved, at least partially, when someone identifying herself as Katie's sister spoke up. Katie hadn't gone missing at all. She'd made it home safely, on a different boat, with a different group of people entirely. She was never lost. She simply wasn't part of the search because B. That single clarification also says something about how easily a case like this one can generate fear that outpaces the facts. For a short window, real people were worried a second teenager might be missing, based on nothing more than a name mentioned in passing, and a game of telephone that stretched it into something it never was. Nobody did anything wrong by worrying. That's simply what happens when information moves faster than confirmation does. It's a small-scale preview of the exact dynamic driving the larger case, and worth remembering the next time an unconfirmed detail starts spreading before anyone's had the chance to check it. B. That clears up one question and immediately opens another, more pointed one. If Katie made it home safely on a separate boat, what does that tell us about the last time she actually saw Nolan? Did she see him walk back toward the boat everyone else left on? Did she see him at all after their conversation ended? Nobody in any of the coverage of this case has said, on the record, what Katie herself remembers about those final minutes, whether she watched him get on that boat, watched him wave it off, or never saw where he went next at all. It's worth being careful here because this is exactly the kind of detail that's easy to build into something it isn't. Nothing about a girl named Katie implicates her in anything. Nothing about this thread suggests wrongdoing by anyone. What it does is narrow the window. If the last confirmed interaction anyone can point to is a conversation between Nolan and a girl who then left safely on another boat, then whatever happened to him happened sometime after that conversation ended, and before anyone else on that island realized he wasn't with the group anymore. That's a real gap in the timeline, and right now, it doesn't have anyone's account filling it in. That's the shape so much of this case keeps taking, thread after thread. Not a smoking gun. A series of small, ordinary-sounding details: a conversation with a girl, a boat that left without him, a phone left behind, that on their own explain almost nothing, and together explain even less than they should for a case that's now weeks old. Somewhere between, he stayed to talk to Katie, and his body was found face down at the shoreline. There's an account nobody has given yet. Katie's isn't the only missing piece. It might just be the first one chronologically, and the one most likely to still be sitting in someone's memory, waiting for the right person to ask the right question. It's worth noticing how a detail this small can carry so much weight in a story this large. Katie isn't a suspect. She isn't accused of anything. She's barely even a character in most retellings of this case, a first name mentioned once, then dropped. But she may be the last person who spoke with Nolan while he was still simply a teenager enjoying a holiday, before whatever happened next started happening. In almost every missing person case, there's a version of Katie somewhere in the timeline, the person who saw the last ordinary moment, unaware at the time that it would turn out to be the last one at all. Finding that person, and asking them the right questions early, is often the difference between a case that resolves in days and one that drags on for months. In Nolan's case, weeks in, nobody seems to have had that conversation with her yet, at least not publicly. That gap alone is worth naming, independent of anything else this case has raised. It's also worth saying plainly that a thread like this one is exactly why patience matters in a case that's already generated so much impatience online. The temptation, once a name like Katie surfaces, is to either build a theory around her immediately or dismiss her as irrelevant just as fast. Both instincts skip the actual work. A serious investigation doesn't need Katie to be dramatic. It needs her to be interviewed calmly and thoroughly, the same way it needs every other person on that island interviewed. Not because any of them are suspected of anything, but because a full timeline is built out of small, ordinary accounts stitched together, not out of a single dramatic confession. If this case ever does resolve into a clear answer, it's far more likely to come from 20 unremarkable conversations like the one Katie could presumably have with investigators than from any single smoking gun revelation. That's rarely how real cases actually get solved, however unsatisfying that is compared to how they get solved on television. There's a broader lesson in how quickly Katie's name surfaced and then nearly vanished again, and it applies to almost everyone connected to this case who isn't Nolan himself. A name appears, attached to a fragment of a story. For a day or two, that fragment gets picked apart online, stretched in directions it was never built to hold. Then, without ever being fully resolved, it fades as a newer detail takes its place in the feed. Katie's thread didn't get resolved. It got replaced. That's worth noticing because it means this case, like most cases that unfold this publicly, is full of loose ends that were never actually tied off, just outpaced by whatever came next. A real investigation doesn't get to work that way. It has to go back for the loose ends the public has already moved past, because sometimes the answer that matters most is sitting in exactly the thread everyone else stopped paying attention to first. It's tempting, looking back over this case, to try to rank the threads by importance, to say the throat matters more than Katie, or the boat's timeline matters more than either. That instinct, understandable as it is, misses something about how these investigations actually come together. A timeline isn't built from one dominant thread. It's built from every thread laid side by side, cross-checked against each other, until the small inconsistencies between them either resolve into a coherent picture or reveal exactly where the picture breaks down. Katie's account, whatever it turns out to be, is one piece of that lattice. So is the boat's GPS. So is the missing hyoid bone. None of them individually proves anything. All of them together are what an actual complete investigation is supposed to weave into a single account, and right now that weaving simply hasn't happened in public, whatever may or may not be happening behind closed doors. Katie's account, whenever it comes, will only ever be one piece of a much larger, much colder trail. Set aside the phone. Set aside the throat, the toxicology, every unanswered medical question for a moment. There's a simpler record sitting underneath all of it. A boat doesn't lie about where it's been because its GPS logs every single stop whether anyone wants it to or not. And the boat's own timeline, laid out end to end, raises questions that don't require a medical degree to understand. 9:56 in the morning. That's when the boat left its original dock, according to tracking data cited in coverage of the case. Simple enough. A group of teenagers heading out for a holiday on the water. 11:14 a.m. The boat reaches Horn Island. An hour and 18 minutes of travel, and then hours of what everyone involved has described as an ordinary day, swimming, drinking, a crowd that would eventually grow to 300 or 400 people scattered across the island by the time it was all over. Then the timeline gets complicated. At around 4 in the afternoon, someone aboard placed a call to the Coast Guard. The boat was taking on water. Help was needed. When asked directly whether everyone aboard was accounted for and in good health, the answer that came back was yes. Everybody's on board, everybody's fine. It's a small detail that's easy to miss on a first listen and impossible to unhear once you've caught it. Nobody asked, and nobody specified, exactly who everybody referred to. Was Nolan still considered part of that group at 4 p.m.? Nobody officially has said. 4:31 p.m. The boat leaves Horn Island under tow, pulled for roughly 3 miles before the tow is released. From there, instead of continuing on to wherever it was ultimately headed, the boat makes its way back to the original dock, arriving at 5:44 p.m. That's over an hour after the tow ended. An hour during which a boat that had just reported taking on water badly enough to need professional towing was apparently well enough to travel under its own power, unassisted, back to where it started. From there, the boat doesn't stay put. It heads out again, this time to a second location. It returns to the original dock once more at 6:06 p.m. Then it makes the same trip a second time, back out and back again, before it's finally hauled out of the water entirely and loaded onto a trailer for the night. Read straight through. That's not the timeline of a boat in crisis. It's the timeline of a boat that reported an emergency, got help, and then spent the rest of the evening running errands. Maybe there's a perfectly ordinary explanation for every leg of that trip, picking people up, dropping others off, addressing whatever mechanical issue actually caused the water intake in the first place. Nobody official has laid that explanation out in public. Until someone does, the gap between the boat is sinking at 4 o'clock and the boat is making multiple more trips by 6:30 is exactly the kind of detail that invites the question nobody's answered yet. What actually happened in between? There's one more piece of this that deserves its own attention, because it complicates the sinking boat story rather than simply raising questions about it. The towing company that responded to that afternoon call gave its own account afterward, separate from anything the boat's occupant said. According to that account, its involvement ended because the boat's owner told them assistance was no longer needed, that help had already been arranged through someone else. If that's accurate, then whatever emergency prompted that first call had already been resolved by the time professional help arrived, which raises its own version of the same question hanging over everything else in this case. Resolved by what, exactly, and by whom? None of this proves anything happened to Nolan specifically on that boat, at that dock, during that stretch of missing hours. What it proves is that there's a documented, time-stamped record of exactly how that vessel moved through the water that afternoon and evening, and that record has never been walked through publicly by anyone with the authority to explain it. A trial attorney who weighed in on this same timeline made a fair point, wanting to know whether the boat's malfunction was real and whether it was properly repaired is a legitimate question, not an accusation. But legitimate questions don't answer themselves. Somebody has the answer to what that boat was doing for those 2.5 hours. So far, nobody's been asked to give it in public on the record, in a way that actually accounts for every stop on that map. The phone tells its own version of this same story, and it starts with a detail that sounds almost too ordinary to matter until you learn what it can actually prove. According to a digital forensics expert who's worked cases at exactly this level of scrutiny, every application on a modern smartphone operates like its own sealed container. Whatever happens inside that container, a photo taken, a message sent, a story posted, a story deleted, leaves a trace inside it, whether or not the content itself survives. Delete a single photo on an iPhone and it doesn't vanish. It sits recoverable for roughly 30 to 40 days, sitting in a digital equivalent of a trash can before it's gone for good. Empty that trash deliberately, and the photo itself may become unrecoverable, but the record of someone doing that and exactly when does not disappear. It becomes a log entry instead of a photograph, And log entries are exactly what forensic investigators are trained to find. Android devices work differently and less forgivingly for anyone hoping evidence survives. Depending on the specific device and how it's configured, some of that same recoverable window can shrink to as little as a single day before certain data, like location history, gets purged for good. That's not a detail included to alarm anyone. It's included because it means time is not a neutral factor here. Whatever's true about Nolan's phone, whether that missing day of activity was a dead zone with no signal or something else entirely, the ability to answer that question conclusively narrows every single day nobody official pursues it. The same expert pointed to a Real, previously solved case as an example of exactly how far this kind of analysis can go, a case where deleted data, recovered properly, became one of the most important pieces of evidence investigators had. Not because deleting something makes you guilty. Because deleting something and getting away with it depends entirely on nobody ever looking closely enough to notice. Sporadic, selective deletion, removing one post here, one story there, rather than wiping a device clean all at once, tends to stand out clearly to anyone trained to spot it, precisely because it looks so different from how a person actually behaves day-to-day online. 2 records then. A boat whose GPS knows exactly where it went and when. A phone whose deleted data, if it exists, is still sitting somewhere, degrading by the day. Neither one requires speculation to understand. Both of them require someone with the authority to pull the data and the willingness to make what they find public. So far, in this case, that hasn't happened. That absence, more than any single piece of forensic testimony, is what's kept this story alive as long as it has. There's a reason digital and mechanical evidence like this tends to carry more weight in the long run than eyewitness accounts do, and it's worth naming here because so much of this case has otherwise relied on people's memories of a chaotic day. A phone doesn't get nervous under questioning. A GPS log doesn't second-guess itself, doesn't want to protect a friend, doesn't forget details under the pressure of being asked the same question for the 3rd time by a stranger with a badge. It simply records what happened, indifferent to how anyone feels about the answer. That's exactly why these 2 threads deserve more attention than they've received publicly so far. Not because they're more dramatic than the autopsy findings, because they're less contestable. A pathologist can debate the meaning of a reddened area in good faith. Nobody can seriously debate what a timestamp says. Records like these don't resolve every question this case has raised. But they resolve the ones they touch with a level of certainty almost nothing else in this story has been able to offer yet, and that alone should have made them the first place, not the last, that anyone looked. There's a broader point buried in all of this record-keeping that's easy to lose in the specifics of any one timestamp. Every system involved in this case, the boat's GPS, the phone's operating system, the Coast Guard's call log, was already quietly doing its job on July 4th, recording exactly what happened without waiting to be asked. That's the strange comfort underneath an otherwise frustrating case. The truth, in a mechanical sense, was never actually lost. It was captured in real time by systems that don't forget, don't get intimidated, and don't have a reason to shade their account one way or the other. What's been missing this entire time isn't the truth. It's permission. Someone deciding that these ordinary, unglamorous records are worth pulling together and reading in public, in full, without waiting for public pressure to make that decision first. That's a strange kind of optimism to end this thread on, but it's a real one. Nothing about this case requires a breakthrough. It requires someone finally doing the paperwork. Step back from all of it for a moment. Set aside the individual threads, the timelines, the competing experts. What's left is a simpler, harder question about why this case has needed so much outside pressure just to get this far. Here's an opinion, and it's worth saying plainly instead of hiding it inside a question. This case should never have gotten as far as it has without a straight answer from the people whose job it is to give one. Not because the answer has to be sinister. It might not be. Accidents happen on the water constantly, and most of them really are exactly what they look like. Tragic, senseless. Nobody's fault beyond a series of small decisions that looked harmless in the moment. If that's what happened to Nolan Wells, that would still be devastating, and it would still deserve to be said clearly and early, because a family in that position deserves to grieve without also having to fight for basic information. What makes this case different isn't the tragedy itself. Tragedies like this happen every summer, on every coastline in this country, and most of them never generate a single national headline. What makes this one different is the gap between how fast the explanation arrived and how slow the actual evidence has been to catch up to it. An hour. That's how long it took for accidental, no foul play to become the working narrative, a narrative that's proven remarkably durable, even now, even with a second autopsy calling the manner of death undetermined, even with a missing throat and an unexplained mark on the back of a skull that nobody's been able to close the book on. That's the part worth sitting with as its own subject, separate from whatever eventually turns out to be true. A narrative set in 60 minutes is doing a kind of work that evidence, arriving weeks later, structurally cannot undo. By the time undetermined became the official word, most of the country had already absorbed a simpler one. That's not a failure of the second autopsy. It's a demonstration of how much power the first sentence in a story actually has, regardless of whether it turns out to be accurate. There's a pattern worth naming here too, and it isn't a conspiracy theory. It's closer to a statistic with a face attached to it every time it repeats. Daniel Irvin, Tyler Smith, now Nolan Wells. 3 teenagers, 3 different states, 3 sets of circumstances that don't overlap in any specific detail except one. In each case, the group of people present when a young black man died walked away largely unquestioned, while physical evidence that could have answered the hardest questions, a phone, a set of clothes, a gun, a throat, ended up gone, withheld, or unexplained. You don't need to believe any single one of those 3 cases involves foul play to notice that the pattern itself is the problem. A system that consistently produces this exact shape of unanswered question, case after case, isn't unlucky. It's revealing something about how seriously certain deaths get investigated compared to others. It would be dishonest to pretend the online reaction to this case has been uniformly measured. It hasn't. Some of it has curdled into exactly the kind of certainty that outpaces the evidence, people naming names, assigning motive, treating a comment section consensus as though it were a courtroom verdict. That's a real problem, and it deserves to be named as clearly as the pattern above. But it's worth asking what actually produces that kind of overcorrection in the first place. People don't arrive at wild speculation out of nowhere. They arrive there after watching official channels move slowly, or not at all, on cases that look exactly like this one. Impatience with a broken process isn't the same thing as malice, even when it produces conclusions that go further than the facts support. The right response to that impatience isn't to dismiss it. It's to give people an actual, credible, timely answer, so there's nothing left to fill the silence with guesswork. That's the opinion underneath everything else in the script, if it has to be reduced to one sentence. Undetermined shouldn't be where this case lives for months on end. It's a legitimate place for it to start. It's not a legitimate place for it to stay, not when the tools to move past it, the toxicology report, the throat structures, a full accounting of the boat's timeline already exist and are simply sitting, unreleased, in someone's file somewhere. Whatever happened to Nolan Wells, his parents have earned the right to know it. Not eventually. Not once the news cycle's moved on and nobody's watching anymore. Now, while there are still 300 to 400 witnesses who are on that island, still memories that haven't faded, still evidence that hasn't degraded past the point of being useful. Every week this stays undetermined is a week where the true answer gets a little harder to reach and a family gets a little more practice living with a question mark instead of a period. There's a role in all of this that doesn't get talked about enough, and it belongs to coverage itself, to shows like this one, to the panels, the broadcasts, the comment sections. Media attention isn't a neutral bystander in a case like this. It's one of the only mechanisms, short of a subpoena, that can actually pressure a slow-moving institution into producing an answer faster than it otherwise would. That's a real power, and it comes with a real responsibility to use it carefully, to keep the pressure aimed at the actual gaps in the investigation, rather than at any individual person. Nobody's charged with anything. Get that balance right, and coverage becomes part of the solution, a reason for institutions to move faster, precisely because they know people are watching closely enough to notice if they don't. Get it wrong, and coverage becomes just another kind of noise, drowning out the actual, answerable questions underneath it with speculation that was never going to lead anywhere useful. This case, more than most, has tested that balance in real time, in front of an audience large enough that the stakes of getting it wrong were never abstract. It's also worth naming what this case would look like if it worked the way it's supposed to. Not a viral phenomenon. Not a months-long fight requiring a celebrity-funded reward and a nationally recognized pathologist just to get a second look. It would look almost boring. By comparison, a thorough investigation opened immediately, every witness interviewed promptly while memories were still fresh, findings released as they became available rather than bundled and delayed, and a family kept informed as a matter of routine rather than having to text a sheriff themselves to find out if anyone was still working the case. Boring, in this context, would have been a mercy. What this family got instead was the opposite of boring, and every bit of that spectacle, the press conferences, the panels, the reward money, the comment sections, exists because the boring, ordinary version of justice never showed up when it was supposed to. That's ultimately the opinion this entire script is built around, stated one last time as plainly as it can be. Nolan Wells didn't need the internet to care about him for his death to matter. It shouldn't have taken a viral video, a celebrity-funded reward, and a room full of national reporters for his case to receive the kind of scrutiny every family deserves as a matter of course, not as something they have to fight and organize and fundraise their way into. The fact that it did take all of that is the real story here, underneath the forensic details and the comment section theories and the competing expert opinions. A system that only takes a death this seriously once it's already impossible to ignore isn't a system working correctly with room for improvement. It's a system that's already told you, by its own actions in that first hour, exactly how seriously it intended to take this before the world forced its hand. It helps to say all of this again plainly, without the vocabulary that makes it sound more complicated than it is. Strip away the medical vocabulary for a second, and this case is easier to understand than it sounds. Picture a book with its final chapter torn out before anyone got to read it. Everyone still gets to see the cover, the opening pages, most of the plot. But the ending, the part that actually explains everything that came before it, is missing, and nobody said where it went. That's what a second autopsy, without the throat structures, actually is. Not a blank page. A deliberately withheld one, sitting somewhere, unread by the one person whose job is to make sense of the rest of the story. Or think about it like a jury handing down a verdict before opening statements have even started. That's the closest comparison for what happened in the first hour after Nolan's body was found, a conclusion reached before the trial, so to speak, had begun. Juries aren't allowed to work that way for a reason. Verdicts delivered before the evidence is heard aren't verdicts. They're guesses wearing a verdict's clothing, and once a guess like that gets said out loud in public, it's remarkably hard to convince people to unhear it, even after real evidence eventually says something different. The reward money works almost like an auction if you think about it the right way. In a normal auction, silence costs you nothing. You just don't win the item. This is the opposite. Every week that goes by without anyone coming forward, the price of continued silence goes up, not down. That's not a moral claim about anyone specific. It's closer to a law of behavior, the same one that governs almost any situation where a person is weighing the risk of speaking against the risk of staying quiet. Early on, when a case is small and unnoticed, staying quiet feels safe by default. Nobody's watching closely enough to notice a small inconsistency, a convenient gap in a story, a detail that doesn't quite line up. But a case like this one doesn't stay small. Every week it grows, the room watching gets larger, the scrutiny gets sharper, and the number of people who might eventually notice an inconsistency multiplies. What felt safe in week 1 starts to feel considerably less safe by week 6, and that shift in perceived risk is exactly what a growing reward and a growing audience is designed to accelerate. It doesn't force anyone to talk. It simply makes the math of staying silent worse with every passing week, until for someone it stops adding up. Somewhere out there, if the family and the investigators are right, is someone doing quiet math about how long they can afford to stay quiet before the number on the table makes staying quiet feel like the worst bet. That's not a guess about what happened. It's just how incentives work, whether you're talking about a missing dog or a missing answer. The boat's timeline is easiest to picture as a getaway car that circles back to the scene. Imagine calling for a tow truck because your car's broken down on the side of the highway, and then, an hour after the tow truck leaves, Your car's back on the road, running errands, making stops, showing up in 2 or 3 more places before the night's over. Anyone who heard that story would ask the same question without needing a law degree to know it was worth asking. So, was it actually broken, or wasn't it? That's the boat, minus the highway and the tow truck, but with the exact same unanswered question sitting in the middle of it. The lividity argument, the one about whether that mark on the back of Nolan's head means anything, is easiest to picture as a stain on a carpet. From across the room, a dark red stain looks the same whether it's spilled wine or something worse. You can't tell the difference by looking at it. You have to test it up close, under the right conditions, before you can say anything with real confidence. Right now, everyone arguing about that mark on Nolan's skull, the doctors, the panels, the strangers in comment sections at 2 a.m, is standing across the room, squinting at a stain nobody's actually been able to test to the degree that would settle it. And the comment section itself is closer to a courtroom gallery than most people give it credit for. In an actual courtroom, the gallery doesn't get a vote. They don't decide guilt or innocence. But they watch everything, they whisper to each other in real time, and by the time a verdict actually comes down, the room already has a strong sense of where it's leaning, sometimes right, sometimes badly wrong, but never silent and never fully separate from the case unfolding in front of them. That's exactly what's happening online right now with Nolan Wells. Millions of people who will never sit on a jury for this case are, in effect, sitting in the gallery anyway, and their whispering has become loud enough that it's shaping how the case gets covered, whether anyone officially involved wanted that or not. None of these comparisons prove what happened to Nolan Wells. That's not what they're for. They're for making the shape of the problem visible without requiring a forensic pathology degree or a law license to see it, because at its core, this case isn't actually complicated. A young man is dead. The explanation offered for how it happened arrived faster than the evidence that would support it. And every piece of that evidence that could close the gap between those two things, the throat, the toxicology, the boat's full accounting, the phone's missing day, is sitting somewhere unreleased, while a family waits for someone to finally open the book to its last page. Consider for a moment what it actually means to withhold a piece of evidence in a case that's already drawn this level of national attention. It's not a neutral act, even when the reasons behind it are entirely legitimate. Every day that a piece of evidence stays unreleased, it does 2 things at once. It protects whatever process is still ongoing, which is a real and defensible reason. And it also, whether intended or not, allows every theory circulating publicly to keep filling that particular gap with whatever explanation feels most plausible to whoever's doing the filling. Silence isn't a blank space in a story like this one. It's an invitation for the public to write something into it, and once enough people have written the same thing into that gap, it becomes very difficult to convince anyone that the eventual, official answer, whatever it turns out to be, wasn't shaped by the same pressure that built up in the silence beforehand. That's the real argument for releasing information quickly in a case like this one, and it has nothing to do with drama or spectacle. It's about protecting the eventual finding itself, whatever that finding turns out to be. A toxicology report released promptly, even if it shows nothing unexpected, carries more credibility than the same report released 6 months later, after months of theories have already hardened into public belief. The single best thing anyone holding evidence in this case could do, for their own credibility as much as for the family's peace of mind, is stop treating silence as a safe default and start treating transparency as the actual protection it's always been. Even the word undetermined deserves its own comparison, because it's easy to mistake it for a shrug when it's actually closer to a scale that hasn't finished balancing. Picture one of those old 2-pan scales, the kind you see in illustrations of justice itself. On one side sits everything pointing toward an accident. The water, the alcohol likely involved, the ordinary tragedy of young people making a bad decision on a holiday weekend. On the other side sits everything that doesn't fit that story cleanly, the unexplained mark, the missing throat, the boat that kept moving after it was supposedly sinking, the day of missing phone activity. Undetermined doesn't mean the scale is empty. It means both sides currently hold real weight, and nobody with the authority to add the piece that would finally tip it one way or the other has done so yet. That's not indecision. That's honesty about an unfinished process, and it's exactly why the family's faith, the thing Christine and Elmore kept returning to throughout that press conference, matters as more than a private comfort. It's the thing sustaining two people through a wait that has no announced end date, for a scale that only one set of hands currently has the power to finish tipping. One last comparison, and then this act can rest on it. A case like this is sometimes described as a puzzle, and that's close, but not quite right. A puzzle assumes every piece already exists somewhere in the box, waiting to be found and placed. This is closer to a puzzle where a few pieces are still sitting in someone else's box entirely: the throat, the toxicology, the boat's full record, and no amount of rearranging the pieces already on the table will complete the picture without them. That's the frustration driving every panel, every caller, every comment section discussed across the script. Not that the picture is hard to read. That the picture is, by design or by delay, still missing pieces that exist and simply haven't been handed over yet. Maybe the simplest way to picture the whole case, in the end, is a phone call that rings and rings without ever being picked up. Somewhere, the person who could answer it exists. The number is real. The line isn't disconnected. It's just that nobody with the ability to pick up is chosen to yet, and every ring that goes unanswered is a small, cumulative statement about how much this case has actually been prioritized versus how much it's simply been allowed to keep ringing in the background while everyone waits. That's not a comparison meant to accuse anyone specific of ignoring the phone. It's a comparison meant to make one thing plain. Somebody somewhere is in a position to end this uncertainty today and hasn't, and every day that continues is a choice, whether or not anyone in that position is willing to describe it that way out loud. Strip away the comparisons too, and what's actually being asked for is remarkably small. Strip away the outrage for a moment, and this case doesn't actually need a miracle to move forward. It needs about 4 specific things, and every one of them already exists somewhere, waiting. The toxicology report is the simplest of the 4 because it's already in motion. Nobody has to find it or fight for it. It's a matter of time. The way a photograph in a darkroom is a matter of time. The image is already there, fixed on the paper, and the only thing standing between nothing and a complete picture is letting the process finish. Rushing it wouldn't help anyone. But finishing it and releasing it the moment it's done instead of sitting on it would answer one of the loudest open questions in this entire case with a single document. The throat structures are a different kind of problem because, unlike toxicology, releasing them isn't automatic. It requires a decision. Think of it like a locked drawer in someone else's desk. Nobody's claiming the drawer was stolen. It's simply locked, held by someone who hasn't yet explained when, or whether, they intend to open it for the person who's been asking. The difference between an ordinary locked drawer and a suspicious one isn't the lock itself. It's how long the person holding the key stays silent about when they'll use it. The boat's full record is the 3rd piece, and it's the one that would take the least effort to produce, and would probably answer the most. GPS data, phone records, the actual sequence of who called for a tow, and why the boat kept moving afterward. None of that requires a lab, a microscope, or weeks of waiting. It requires someone with subpoena power deciding that a timeline this strange, in a case that's drawn this much attention, deserves to be walked through in public instead of pieced together secondhand from broadcasts and comment sections. Think of it like security footage outside a store after a break-in. Nobody has to guess what happened if the footage already exists. Somebody just has to pull it and show it. The 4th piece is the phone, and it's the one where time actually works against everyone hoping for an answer. Every day that passes without a proper forensic acquisition is a day closer to some of that recoverable data aging past the point where anyone can retrieve it. It's less like a locked drawer and more like a photograph left out in direct sunlight, recoverable today, faded a little more with every day nobody picks it up. None of these 4 things require a confession from anyone. None of them require assuming the worst about a single person who is on that boat or that island. What they require is exactly what Nolan's parents asked for from the very first press conference, in the plainest language available. Treat this case the way you'd treat it if it were your own child. Not slower. Not with more excuses about process. The same urgency, the same resources, the same willingness to make things public the moment they're ready, that any family with real institutional power would receive as a matter of course. That's really the whole argument underneath every act of this script. This was never a case that required extraordinary measures to solve. It required ordinary ones, applied without delay, without selective silence, and without deciding the ending before the investigation had properly started. A missing throat gets released, or someone explains clearly why it hasn't been. Toxicology gets published the moment it's ready, not the moment it's convenient. A boat's timeline gets walked through by someone with actual authority to do it, instead of being reconstructed secondhand by strangers squinting at flight radar footage online. A phone gets a proper forensic acquisition before the window on its data closes for good. Do all four of those things, and undetermined either resolves into an answer, or it resolves into something almost as valuable, genuine, demonstrated confirmation that everything possible really was done, and that the outcome, whatever it turns out to be, wasn't the product of anyone looking away. Right now, this case doesn't have that confirmation. It has silence standing in the space where that confirmation should be. And silence, unlike evidence, doesn't get more convincing the longer it lasts. It just gets harder to explain. There's an urgency to all four of these pieces that's easy to lose in a case that's already stretched across weeks. Evidence doesn't wait patiently for institutions to get around to it. It behaves more like an untreated wound, manageable early, when it's fresh, and progressively harder to fully heal the longer it's left unaddressed. A boat's crew remembers a timeline clearly in week 1 and less clearly in week 12. A cell tower's records get overwritten on a schedule nobody in this case controls. A body's tissue keeps changing every single day it isn't examined. None of the four things this case needs get easier to produce with time. Every one of them gets harder, and every official delay, whatever its reason, is quietly working against the same outcome everyone claims to want, an answer that's actually still possible to find. None of this requires anyone watching to become an investigator themselves. It requires something smaller and more sustainable than that, attention that doesn't expire the moment a more urgent headline pushes this one down the feed. Cases like this one are rarely solved by a single viral moment. They're solved, when they're solved at all, by attention that holds steady long enough that quietly closing the file becomes harder than actually finishing it. That's the only leverage a family without institutional power ultimately has, making sure that whoever is sitting on the throat, the toxicology, the boat's full record, and the phone's missing day understands that nobody watching this case is going anywhere until those four things surface, one way or another. That's a smaller ask than it might sound like at first. It doesn't require anyone to assume guilt, to accuse a specific person, or to decide the outcome in advance. It requires exactly what a fair process should have provided from the very first hour, and what Nolan's parents have been asking for at every single podium since. Follow the evidence, wherever it leads, and say so publicly once it does. That standard shouldn't be remarkable. In this case, weeks in, it still hasn't been met, and until it is, undetermined will keep being the only honest word anyone can offer a family that deserves, at minimum, to know their son was never just a headline that got to fade. Picture, for a moment, what the alternative actually looks like in practice. Not a dramatic confession, not a courtroom scene, just a press release, plain and unremarkable, stating that the throat structures have been released for comparison, that toxicology came back showing exactly what it showed, that the boat's full GPS record has been reviewed and explained publicly, that the phone's forensic acquisition is complete and its findings are part of the record. That's it. That's the whole ask, stripped of every bit of drama this case has accumulated along the way. It wouldn't trend. It probably wouldn't even make a headline on its own. But it would be the first moment since July 4th that this family got to stop treading water in a word like undetermined and start standing on something solid enough to actually grieve on. That's not too much to ask. It's the bare minimum every family deserves, and it's the only ending to this story that was ever actually required. So that's where this stands in full tonight. Not a verdict, not an accusation. A boy who was here and then wasn't, and a list of ordinary, answerable questions that have sat unanswered for far longer than they should have. A red mark nobody's explained. A throat nobody's released. A boat that told two different stories depending on which hour you're looking at. A phone with a day missing from it. Two other families who know exactly what this feels like because they've lived it themselves. And two parents who have said, from the very first sentence of this, that all they want is the truth, whatever it turns out to be, delivered honestly and delivered soon. It isn't a lot to ask for. It's the least any family deserves. If this case has stayed with you the way it's clearly stayed with hundreds of thousands of others, subscribe and follow along, because the moment any of these 4 things surfaces, we'll be the ones bringing it to you first. And if you know anything about what happened